The cabin stood like a scar on the landscape, half swallowed by the forest, its jagged edges fighting the onslaught of vines and moss that sought to claim it. I had never seen anything like it. Even the air seemed to thicken as we approached, pressing against our lungs like it wanted us to turn back. But none of us did. We had come too far, too curious, too stupid to heed the warnings etched into the very silence of this place. Rachel was the first to step inside, brushing aside a tangle of cobwebs that clung to the doorway. The floor creaked beneath her weight, the sound slicing through the oppressive stillness like a scream. "Wade." I followed close behind, my flashlight slicing through the dark, illuminating fragments of what had once been a life. A chair lay toppled in the corner, its wood splintered. A rusted stove sat cold and unused, its metal flaking like dead skin. And then there was the table. It was small, unassuming, tucked against the far wall. But my eyes locked onto it immediately. The surface was scarred, gouged with deep scratches that formed no pattern I could decipher. At its center sat a book, or rather, what was left of one. The cover was brittle and blackened, as if it had been too close to some long-forgotten fire. The pages, curled and yellowed, seemed ready to disintegrate at the slightest touch. Rachel picked it up before I could say a word. "Every word." Her fingers trembled as she opened it, and I swear the room grew colder. The pages were covered in writing, but not the kind that made sense. The words twisted and bent, spiraling into nonsensical shapes, some overlapping, some smeared as though the writer had been in a frenzy. And yet, amid the chaos, one phrase stood out, etched so deeply into the page it had torn the paper. "Don't listen to the whispers." Mark laughed, a short, nervous bark that made us all jump. "Someone was really losing it here," he said, his voice too loud, too hollow. But no one responded. The words seemed to linger in the air, sinking into our minds like hooks. Night fell fast in the forest, as if the sun had been swallowed whole. The cabin groaned with each gust of wind, its walls shuddering as though alive. We huddled around a weak fire, the flames barely strong enough to push back the darkness. None of us spoke much. It wasn't just the book. It was the forest itself. There was something wrong about it, something I couldn't explain. The trees didn't feel like trees. They felt like watchers. The first sound came just after midnight, a faint rustling outside, like dry leaves being stirred by unseen hands. Mark went to the window, peering into the black void beyond. "Probably just a deer," he said, but his voice cracked on the last word. He didn't move away from the glass. I didn't move away from the glass. The rustling grew louder, more deliberate, circling the cabin. I gripped the edge of my sleeping bag, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But run where? There was nothing but miles of forest in every direction. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and low, almost indistinguishable from the wind. It wasn't calling for help. It wasn't even speaking words I could understand, but it knew me. I could feel it. Rachel sat up suddenly, her face pale in the dim firelight. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Her eyes darted toward the door, then the windows, then back to us. Mark shook his head, but he wouldn't meet her gaze. Claire didn't answer at all. She just stared at the dying fire, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, layering over each other, until they became an almost deafening hum. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, worming its way into my skull, wrapping around my thoughts like a vice. And then it stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse. It felt heavy, suffocating, as though the world itself had paused, waiting for something. Rachel moved first, scrambling to her feet and grabbing the flashlight. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to go now." Mark protested. Of course. He always had to play the skeptic, even when everything around us screamed otherwise. But even he couldn't deny the fear in his eyes. As he packed up his gear, we left the cabin in a hurry. The fire still smoldering in the hearth, the book abandoned on the table where we'd found it. The forest was worse at night. The trees loomed taller, their branches clawing at the sky. The ground seemed to shift beneath our feet, forcing us to slow, to stumble. Every sound became a threat. The crack of a twig, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves that never seemed far enough away. We didn't speak, didn't even look at each other. All our focus was on moving forward, on putting as much distance as possible between us and that cursed cabin. But it didn't matter. The whispers followed, faint at first, then louder, then impossibly close. I don't know when we realized Ethan was gone. One moment he was there, just a step ahead, and the next he wasn't. We called his name, our voices breaking the fragile silence. But there was no response, just the forest, stretching endlessly in every direction, and the whispers, always the whispers. Rachel found the first sign of him. A footprint, deep and clear, leading off the trail and into the trees. "He wouldn't," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not in the dark. He wouldn't leave the group, but he had. We had no choice but to follow, our flashlights barely penetrating the thick blackness. The trees seemed to close in around us, their gnarled roots reaching out to trip us. And then we saw it, a glint of metal beneath a thick layer of pine needles. It was a door, half buried in the earth, its surface streaked with rust. Strange symbols had been etched into the metal, their lines jagged and crude, as if carved in desperation. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic, as we stood there, staring at the door. Rachel reached for the handle. I wanted to stop her, to scream at her to leave it alone, but the words caught in my throat. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase spiraling down into darkness. And somewhere below, faint but unmistakable, was Ethan's voice calling for help. The staircase was a gaping maw, swallowing the faint beam of Rachel's flashlight as she descended. The cold was immediate, wrapping around me like icy fingers. The air grew heavier with each step, and the metallic tang of rust mixed with something else. Something sickly sweet, like rot, left too long in the sun. The walls were close, pressing in, carved from rough stone that felt damp when my fingertips brushed against it. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd grown louder, more insistent, bleeding into the darkness around us like ink spilled on paper. Ethan, deep. Rachel's voice cracked as she called out again, her flashlight jittering with the tremble of her hand. His voice answered, faint and distant, somewhere below. It didn't sound right. There was no urgency, no fear. Just the monotony of someone speaking words they didn't understand. Mark stayed close behind her, muttering curses under his breath. He had his camera out, pointing it into the abyss, but the little red light indicating it was recording had gone out. He smacked it once, twice, and hissed something about the battery. Brand new this morning, he muttered, his voice tinged with irritation and a hint of something else, something closer to fear. Claire followed after him, clutching her backpack like it might save her. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her face pale and drawn, her eyes flickering to the shadows pooling at the edges of the stairwell. I was last, my hand brushing the cold railing, my legs moving despite every nerve in my body, screaming at me to stop. The staircase seemed endless. Onwards, at least till. Each step echoed as we descended, the sound ricocheting off the walls like a reminder that we shouldn't be here. The whispers became less like voices and more like pressure, sinking into my skull, clawing at the edges of my thoughts. I tried to focus on the physicality of the stairs, the scrape of my boots against stone, the chill of the railing, the weight of my backpack. But it didn't help. The voices found the cracks in my concentration, slipping through like water through a broken dam. Then, without warning, the staircase ended. Rachel's flashlight swept across a wide open chamber, illuminating jagged walls covered in scratches. At first, I thought they were natural, the result of time and erosion. But as I stepped closer, I realized they weren't random. They were deliberate. Symbols carved with a purpose, their lines uneven and desperate, overlapping in chaotic patterns. Some resembled letters, though they weren't part of any alphabet I knew. Others were spirals and jagged shapes, their sharp angles twisting into something that made my head ache if I stared too long. Rachel shone her light across the room, and we all saw it at the same time. A figure slumped against the far wall, barely illuminated by the dim beam. "Ethan!" she gasped, rushing forward. I wanted to stop her, to pull her back, but my body refused to move. Ethan didn't look up as she approached. He sat with his back to the wall, his head tilted to the side, his arms limp at his sides. His clothes were damp, stained with something dark that I didn't want to identify. Rachel knelt beside him, shaking his shoulder. And you were beside him. Ethan, come on, get up. We have to go. He moved, slowly, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. His head turned toward her, and for a moment I thought he was smiling, but as the light hit his face, I realized it wasn't a smile at all. His lips were cracked and dry, pulled back too far, exposing teeth, stained red. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring past Rachel, past all of us, into something we couldn't see. It's here, he whispered. His voice was raw, like he'd been screaming for hours. It sees you. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the light from our flashlights seemed to dim. Mark backed away, his camera hanging useless at his side. We need to get out of here, he said, his voice low and shaking. Right now. But Rachel didn't move. She was frozen, her hand still on Ethan's shoulder. He began to shake, his body convulsing in sharp, jerky movements. His head snapped back, and he let out a sound that didn't belong to him, a guttural, inhuman noise that echoed off the walls and sent shivers down my spine. Then he stopped. His body went limp, collapsing against Rachel, who stumbled back with a cry. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, and his eyes finally closed. Help me get him up, Rachel said, her voice trembling. We can't leave him here. Claire and I stepped forward, hesitating only briefly, before grabbing Ethan under the arms and holding him to his feet. His head lolled forward, and I tried not to think about how cold his skin felt or the way his weight seemed. Wrong. Too heavy, as though we weren't just lifting him, but something else as well. Mark stayed near the entrance, his flashlight flickering. We shouldn't be here, he muttered, more to himself than to us. This isn't right. This place isn't right. As we started toward the staircase, I noticed something on the floor, where Ethan had been sitting. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it caught the light just enough for me to see. A trail of dark, wet streaks leading deeper into the chamber. I looked away quickly, focusing instead on the weight of Ethan's arm slung over my shoulder, the uneven shuffle of his feet as we moved. The whispers followed us up the stairs, growing fainter with each step, but never disappearing entirely. When we finally reached the surface, I thought I would feel relief, but the forest was no better. The trees pressed closer, their branches twisted and gnarled. The air was thick, heavy, clinging to my skin like a second layer. The whispers were gone, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt deafening. Ethan stirred, his head lifting slightly. It doesn't let go, he said, his voice barely audible. His eyes met mine, and I saw something there that made my stomach drop. It wasn't fear. It was something worse. Resignation. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We sat around the fire, huddled close, the light barely enough to stave off the darkness. Ethan didn't speak again. He sat motionless, staring into the flames, his expression blank. But the forest didn't stay silent. As the fire burned low, the rustling began again, faint but deliberate, and somewhere in the distance, too far to be real, but too close to ignore, came a voice that wasn't Ethan's but carried his name like a promise. The forest didn't let up. Mua intitutune. By dawn, the fire had long since died, leaving us sitting in a shallow circle of cold ash and brittle wood. Ethan hadn't moved all night. His body remained rigid, his breathing shallow, his eyes fixed on some distant point far beyond the edge of the forest. Mark tried once to speak to him, to shake him from whatever stupor had gripped him. But Ethan's only response was a slow turn of his head and the faintest twitch of a smile. That smile lingered in my mind like a wound. I don't know who suggested we move. Maybe it was Rachel, her voice trembling with barely contained panic. Or maybe it was Claire, desperate to shake the suffocating weight of the forest's silence. But we all knew we couldn't stay there. So we packed our things, or what little we could bring ourselves to touch, and trudged back toward the trail. Or at least, what should have been the trail. The woods didn't look the same. The path we'd taken the day before was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of gnarled roots and dense undergrowth. Mark pulled out his compass, holding it up to the weak light filtering through the canopy. The needle spun lazily, as if unsure of its purpose, before settling on a direction that didn't make sense. "This is wrong," he muttered, his voice tight. "It's like the forest shifted." None of us responded. There was nothing to say. We moved forward, choosing a direction at random, hoping to find a clearing or a landmark, or anything that might orient us. The trees grew thicker as we walked, their branches intertwining above us, blotting out the sun. The air smelled damp, heavy with decay, and every step seemed to echo far louder than it should have. It was Rachel who found it, another cabin, tucked between two massive pines. At first glance it looked identical to the one Wood left behind. The same sagging roof, the same weathered walls, the same sense of something deeply, inherently wrong. But as we approached, it became clear this one wasn't abandoned. The door hung slightly ajar, revealing a faint flickering light from within. A lantern, I thought at first, or maybe a candle. But as we got closer, the light began to shift, to pulse, as though alive. Rachel hesitated at the threshold, her hand hovering over the doorframe. "Shh, we need to check it out," she said, though her voice betrayed her hesitation. "No," Claire said sharply, stepping back. "We don't. We need to keep moving." Rachel ignored her, pushing the door open with the flat of her hand. It creaked on its hinges, the sound piercing the stillness, and we followed her inside. The interior was wrong. The space was too large, too deep, the walls stretching farther than the outside of the cabin should have allowed. The flickering light came from a small fire pit in the center of the room, though the flames burned a strange pale blue. Around it were scattered objects, rusted tools, fragments of pottery, and what looked like bones. Animal, I told myself, though I couldn't be sure. Ethan stood motionless near the fire, his shadow cast long and distorted against the far wall. He hadn't spoken since we left the first cabin, but now he began to hum, low and steady, a sound that made my stomach churn. The symbols from the underground chamber were here too, carved into the floorboards, the walls, even the ceiling. They seemed to shift under the firelight, twisting into new shapes, new meanings, just beyond comprehension. And then there was the mirror. It hung on the far wall, its frame tarnished and cracked, the glass warped and uneven. At first, it reflected nothing but the dim light of the fire, the faint shapes of our bodies. But as I stepped closer, I saw movement, not in the room behind me, but within the mirror itself. Shadows writhed and danced, their forms indistinct, but unmistakably alive. My breath hitched, and for a moment, I couldn't look away. The shadows seemed to reach for me, their outlines sharpening, their fingers curling. "Don't," Claire said sharply, pulling me back. Her grip was firm, her nails digging into my arm. "Don't look at it." Rachel was already moving toward the mirror, her eyes wide, her expression vacant. I grabbed her wrist, pulling her back before she could get too close. She blinked, as if waking from a dream, and shook her head. What was that?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. Mark was circling the room, his camera still in hand, though the screen remained blank. "This place," he muttered, his voice low, almost to himself. "It's like it's watching us." Ethan's humming stopped. The silence that followed was worse, pressing down on us like a weight. He turned to face the mirror, his movements jerky, unnatural. And for a moment, I thought he was going to step through it. Instead, he raised a hand, pressing his palm against the glass. The shadows surged forward, crashing against the surface like a wave, and Ethan shuddered, his body convulsing. Rachel screamed, grabbing his arm and pulling him away, and the mirror shattered. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the cabin, and for a moment I thought the walls themselves might collapse. The shards fell to the floor, glinting in the pale firelight, but the shadows didn't disappear. They spilled out into the room, writhing and twisting, their forms taking shape. Long, thin limbs, hollow faces, eyes that weren't eyes, but endless voids. We ran. I don't remember how we made it out of the cabin, or how we ended up back in the forest, but we didn't stop moving. The shadows followed, slithering between the trees, their whispers turning into low, guttural growls. The forest seemed alive now, the branches reaching for us, the ground shifting beneath our feet. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, we were somewhere new. The trees were thinner here, their trunks pale and smooth like bone. The air was colder, the light dimmer, and in the distance, barely visible through the fog, was another door. This one wasn't hidden. It stood upright in the middle of the clearing, its surface etched with the same jagged symbols we'd seen before. Ethan stepped toward it, his movements steady, deliberate, as if drawn by some invisible force. None of us tried to stop him. We couldn't. Something about the door, about this place, held us in place, paralyzed by a fear too deep to name. Ethan reached for the handle, his hand trembling, and the door creaked open. The forest exhaled, a low rumbling sound that shook the ground beneath our feet. And then everything went still. The door opened with a sound I can only describe as breathing, deep, wet, and shuddering. Ethan stepped through without hesitation, his figure swallowed by the inky blackness beyond the fray. None of us moved to stop him. We were frozen, caught between the instinct to flee and the sickening pull of whatever lay beyond that door. I couldn't explain it, but the doorway radiated something almost magnetic. My body felt heavy, as though my limbs were weighed down by invisible chains. The air around us shifted, growing colder, thicker, until even breathing felt like a struggle. It was Rachel who finally broke the silence, her voice trembling as she called after Ethan. "Come back!" she shouted, the desperation in her voice cutting through the suffocating stillness. "Ethan, don't go any further." Her words disappeared into the void. No echo, no response, just the door, yawning open like the throat of some unimaginable creature. Mark stepped forward, his camera still gripped tightly in his hands. I noticed the red light was back on, flickering weakly like it was struggling to stay alive. "We have to follow him," he said, though his voice betrayed no confidence. His grip on the camera was white-knuckled, his knuckles standing out sharply against the dim light, filtering through the fog. "We can't just leave him." Claire shook her head violently, backing away from the door. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes darting around the clearing like she expected the trees themselves to lunge at her. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't go in there. Don't you feel it? That thing. It's not a door. It's something else." But Mark had already moved closer, his flashlight cutting into the darkness beyond the doorway. "Stay here if you want," he said, though his voice wavered. "I'm not leaving Ethan in there alone." He stepped through. Envelop, Rachel hesitated, looking back at Claire and me, her face pale and streaked with sweat. "We have to," she said, almost pleading. "Shh, we can't leave them." I didn't want to follow. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay in the clearing, to turn and run, and never look back. But something about Rachel's expression, something raw and terrified and determined, forced me to move. Claire clung to my arm as we crossed the threshold together. The world on the other side of the door was raw. That's the only word that fits. It wasn't dark, not exactly, but the light was dim and sourceless, casting strange, flickering shadows across the uneven ground. The air felt damp and heavy, clinging to my skin like oil, and the smell. It was like the forest had rotted from the inside out. A sickly, cloying stench that made my stomach churn. We were in a hallway, impossibly long and narrow, the walls lined with jagged carvings that seemed to shift and writhe if I looked at them too long. The floor beneath our feet was uneven, cracked in places, as though the entire structure was on the verge of collapse. Somewhere ahead, faint and echoing, came the sound of Ethan's voice. He wasn't speaking words, just sounds. Low, guttural noises that didn't sound human. Mark moved ahead, his camera held up like it was a shield. "Ethan," he called, his voice bouncing off the walls. "Where are you?" The answer came not from Ethan, but from the walls themselves. The carvings began to shift, their jagged edges smoothing out into shapes. Faces, contorted and screaming, their mouths stretched wide as though caught mid-cry. The whispers returned, louder now, layering over one another, until they became a deafening roar. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside me, vibrating through my skull, filling every corner of my mind. Rachel grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We have to keep moving," she shouted, though her voice barely carried over the noise. "We can't stay here." We stumbled forward, the hallway stretching endlessly ahead of us. The walls seemed to close in, the faces growing larger, their screams more desperate. Mark was ahead, his flashlight bouncing wildly. With each step, he called Ethan's name again, and this time there was an answer. "Here." The voice was flat, hollow, and far too close. I turned, my flashlight shaking as it swept across the walls. For a moment I thought I saw him. Ethan, standing just a few feet away, his face pale and blank, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. But when I blinked, he was gone, and the hallway was empty again. Claire was crying now, her breaths coming in sharp, shallow gasps. "This isn't real," she kept saying, her voice cracking. "This isn't real. This isn't real." But it was. The hallway ended abruptly, opening into a vast chamber that defied logic. The ceiling stretched high above us, disappearing into darkness, and the walls were lined with more of those impossible carvings. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it sat something I couldn't quite process. An object that seemed to shift and change, its edges blurring, its shape never staying for more than a moment. Ethan was there. He stood beside the pedestal, his hands clasped in front of him, his head tilted back as though staring at something above. His expression was serene, almost blissful, and for a moment I thought he might actually be okay. But then he turned to look at us, and I realized how wrong I was. His eyes were black, completely, utterly black, as though they had been hollowed out and filled with tar. His mouth twitched into a smile that didn't reach those eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was layered, echoing, and discordant. "It's awake," he said. The pedestal began to tremble. and the carvings on the walls lit up with a sickly, pulsating glow. The air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest, and the whispers returned, louder and more frantic than ever. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. And then, from the darkness above, something moved. It was slow at first, almost imperceptible, but as it descended, I saw its shape, a mass of shifting, writhing limbs, its surface glistening like wet stone. It didn't have a face, not exactly, but there were eyes, hundreds of them, scattered across its body, each one blinking and rolling as though searching for something. Its presence filled the room, suffocating and absolute, and as it loomed over us, I felt something crack deep inside me. The last thing I saw before the lights went out completely was Ethan. His smile widening, his black eyes fixed on me as he mouthed a single word. Run. Dewey. The room erupted into chaos. The creature's movements defied logic, its limbs bending and twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. The sound it made wasn't a roar or a scream. It was a vibration, low and bone-deep, reverberating through the chamber like a shockwave. My knees buckled beneath me, the force of it threatening to split my skull. Envelop. Mark screamed, the camera slipping from his hands and shattering on the stone floor. Run? Rachel's voice was hoarse, raw with panic. But I couldn't move. My body felt disconnected from my mind, frozen in place as the creature descended further. Its eyes, hundreds of them, unblinking and cold, seemed to latch onto each of us, pinning us in place. It was Claire who broke first, scrambling backward and dragging me with her. The sudden jolt snapped me out of whatever trance had held me, and I stumbled to my feet, pulling Rachel and Mark as the thing lashed out. One of its limbs, long and slick with some dark, viscous fluid, crashed into the ground where we had been seconds before, sending shards of stone flying in all directions. The pedestal in the center of the room cracked under the impact, releasing a burst of light so bright it seared my vision. I turned away, shielding my eyes, but the light was everywhere, illuminating the carvings on the walls, which now pulsed in rhythm with the creature's movements. It was alive. The entire room was alive, and we were trapped inside it. We bolted toward the hallway, our only thought to escape, but the ground shifted beneath our feet. The chamber seemed to stretch, its walls pulling away, the exit growing smaller and smaller in the distance. The creature moved faster now, its limbs snaking across the floor, blocking our path. Mark grabbed a piece of broken stone and hurled it at the thing, his shout filled with desperation. The rock bounced off its surface with a wet thud, but the creature didn't react. It didn't need to. Another limb shot out, striking the wall beside him, and Mark was thrown backward, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Mark! Rachel screamed, skidding to a stop, but Claire grabbed her arm, dragging her forward. We can't. There's no time. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to ignore the sounds behind me, The shattering of stone, the guttural, otherworldly noises, and Mark's choking gasp. The hallway was ahead, just a few more feet, and I pushed myself harder, every muscle screaming in protest. We reached the opening, collapsing into the narrow corridor as the creature's limbs slammed into the entrance. The walls shuddered, cracks spreading across the surface like spider webs. I turned to see Rachel clutching the edge of the doorway, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Mark," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's gone," Claire said sharply, her own breathing ragged. "We have to keep moving, or we'll be next." The ground beneath us groaned, and I felt it tilt slightly, as though the entire structure were shifting. The hallway seemed narrower now, the walls closing in, the carvings flickering with that sickly, pulsating light. The whispers were back, louder than before, filling the space with a deafening hum. They weren't random anymore. They had meaning, though I couldn't understand the words. They tugged at my thoughts, pulling me towards something I didn't want to see. Ethan's voice broke through the noise, calm and steady despite everything. "It's not over," he said, though I couldn't see him. His voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if it was seeping through the walls. "It doesn't let go," Rachel stumbled, her hand clutching at the wall for support. "Ethan, where are you?" she shouted, her voice raw. "What? Why are you doing this?" His laughter was soft, almost gentle, but it carried an edge that made my stomach twist. "It's not me," he said. "It's always been here. It's always been waiting." The hallway sloped downward, leading us deeper into the earth. The air grew colder, heavier, each breath harder to take. My flashlight flickered, its beam weak and uneven, casting long, jagged shadows that danced across the walls. I tried to focus on the ground, on putting one foot in front of the other, but the whispers grew louder, worming their way into my head. It felt like hours before the hallway opened into another room, smaller this time, with a low ceiling that forced us to crouch. At the center of the space was a pool of water, dark and still, its surface reflecting the faint glow of the carvings. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt unnatural. The water rippled. "Beep, envelop, so." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The ripples spread outward, slow and deliberate, as though something beneath the surface was stirring. Rachel moved close, her flashlight trained on the pool. "Don't," Claire hissed, grabbing her arm. "Stay back." But Rachel ignored her, stepping to the edge of the water. She knelt, her reflection wavering in the rippling surface. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. Are you in there?" The water exploded upward, drenching us in freezing cold as something burst from the depths. I stumbled back, slipping on the wet stone, as a figure emerged, a twisted, grotesque mockery of Ethan. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over sharp bones. His eyes were gone, replaced by gaping black voids, and his mouth twisted into a grin that was too wide, too unnatural. "It sees you," he said, his voice layered, distorted. "It sees everything. Hell." The room shook violently, the walls beginning to crumble. The carvings flared with blinding light, and the water surged outward, flooding the floor. I grabbed Rachel, pulling her back as the thing that used to be Ethan lunged toward us, its limbs jerking and twitching in unnatural movements. We ran, the water rising around our ankles, the hallway collapsing behind us. The whispers returned, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices screaming in unison. The walls began to split, chunks of stone falling around us as we stumbled through the darkness. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but I didn't stop. Ahead, there was light, a faint, flickering glow that grew brighter with each step. I pushed forward, the water dragging at my legs, the whispers clawing at my mind. The light grew brighter, closer, until Emiliant soared one paw. We burst through the doorway and into the forest, collapsing onto the damp earth. The air was cold and sharp, the silence deafening. I turned back toward the door, but it was gone, vanished, as though it had never been there. Rachel was on her knees, gasping for air, her eyes wide and unfocused. Claire sat a few feet away, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, rocking back and forth. None of us spoke. None of us could. Real, palm, dunes stare. The forest was still, the trees looming above us like silent sentinels. And then, from somewhere deep within the woods, came the whispers. The forest closed in around us like a noose, the air thick and suffocating, each breath a struggle. My legs ached, every muscle in my body screaming for rest. But there was no time. The whispers were back, faint and teasing, threading through the trees like a melody just out of reach. They weren't coming from any one direction. They were everywhere, seeping through the air like a toxin. Rachel leaned against a tree, clutching her side. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale, streaked with dirt and tears. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Emuletiokolendu. Just do. Where do we even go?" Claire didn't answer. She stood a few feet away, staring at something in the distance, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her lips moved silently, as though she were praying, though I couldn't imagine any prayer reaching a place like this. I scanned the trees, trying to get my bearings, but everything looked the same. Endless shadows and tangled branches. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam barely cutting through the gloom. I didn't know how long it had been since we'd escaped the chamber, but the light was fading, and so was my sense of time. Morning, night, it didn't matter here. The forest existed outside of all of it, an eternal, unchanging void. Mark was gone. I kept waiting for the realization to hit me, for the full weight of it to crush me, but it didn't. Maybe I was too numb, too exhausted to feel it. Or maybe some part of me had already accepted that we'd never leave this place. Not all of us. I'm... She... Do you hear that? Claire's voice cut through my thoughts, sharp and distant. She hadn't moved, her eyes still fixed on the same point in the distance. Her voice was flat, monotone, as though she was speaking from somewhere far away. It's calling. What? Rachel asked, straightening, though her hand remained pressed to her side. What's calling? Claire didn't respond. She took a step forward, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was being pulled by invisible strings. Don't you hear it? She whispered. It's beautiful. I grabbed her arm, yanking her back. Stop, I said, my voice more forceful than I'd intended. We're not splitting up. Whatever you think you hear, it's not real. Her eyes met mine, wide and glassy, unfocused. For a moment, I thought she might fight me, might try to break away, and run toward whatever was pulling her. But then she blinked, and the tension in her body seemed to snap. She sagged against me, her breathing uneven, tears streaming down her face. I don't know what's happening, she whispered. I can't tell what's real anymore. Neither could I. The whispers were louder now, swirling around us in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint their source. They weren't just voices anymore. They were thoughts, pushing into my mind, twisting and overlapping with my own. Images flashed behind my eyes. The mirror from the chamber, Ethan's hollow face, the writhing limbs of the creature. I shook my head, trying to clear it. But the images only grew sharper, more vivid. We need to move, I said, my voice strained. Huh? We can't stay here. Rachel nodded, though her movements were sluggish, her eyes darting nervously between the trees. We stumbled forward, the forest pressing closer. With every step, the ground was uneven, tangled with roots that seemed to shift beneath our feet. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I found myself straining to hear them, as though some part of me wanted to understand. Rachel stopped suddenly. Her flashlight pointed at something on the ground. What is that? She asked, her voice barely audible. I followed her gaze, my stomach tightening at the sight. It was a trail, dark and wet, cutting through the underbrush like a wound. It wasn't blood. Not exactly, but it wasn't water either. The liquid shimmered faintly in the light, its surface rippling, as though alive. Do we follow it? Claire asked, her voice shaking. No, I said quickly, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The trail was leading somewhere, and as much as I wanted to avoid it, some part of me knew we'd end up there anyway. This place didn't care about what we wanted. It only led us where it wanted us to go. We kept walking, the trail snaking alongside us, its presence a constant reminder of how little control we had. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. They weren't just meaningless sounds anymore. They were words, fragments of sentences, jumbled and distorted, but unmistakably human. It's watching. You can't run. It knows you. The ground beneath us began to change, the roots giving way to smooth, cold stone. The trees thinned, their twisted branches replaced by jagged walls that loomed higher with every step. We were in a tunnel now, though I couldn't remember when we'd entered it. The air was colder here, biting against my skin, and the whispers had grown sharper, more focused, drilling into my skull like 1,000 needles. Rachel's flashlight flickered and went out. She cursed, shaking it violently, but the light didn't return. "I can't see," she said, panic rising in her voice. I can't see anything." My own flashlight was dimming, the beam shrinking until it was barely more than a pinprick. The darkness pressed against us, thick and suffocating, and I felt my grip on reality slipping. The walls seemed to pulse, their jagged surfaces moving like living flesh, and the whispers were inside me now, filling every corner of my mind. Claire screamed. I turned, my flashlight jerking wildly, the beam catching her face for just a moment. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream, and behind her was a shadow, tall and shapeless, its edges shifting and flickering like smoke. It moved toward her, slow and deliberate, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as it enveloped her. She was gone. Rachel grabbed my arm, pulling me forward, her breathing ragged. "We have to go," she said, her voice shaking. "We can't stop. We can't look back." I didn't argue. We ran, the darkness chasing us, the whispers screaming in our ears. The ground beneath us cracked and splintered, the walls closing in, until there was nothing but the sound of our footsteps and the faint flickering light of my dying flashlight. And then, suddenly, there was silence. We stopped, gasping for breath, the tunnel opening into a vast empty space. The walls were smooth and featureless, their surfaces reflecting the faint light from above. At the center of the room was a single figure, standing motionless. It was Ethan. Ethan stood in the center of the chamber, bathed in an eerie glow that had no discernible source. His body was motionless, but something about him felt wrong. His posture too rigid, his head tilted just slightly to the side, like he was listening to something none of us could hear. The air around him seemed to ripple, as though the space itself were bending and warping to accommodate his presence. "Ethan," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. She took a hesitant step forward, but I grabbed her arm, holding her back. There was a weight in the room, an oppressive force pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. Whatever that thing was in front of us, it wasn't Ethan. Not anymore. He turned slowly, his movements jerky and unnatural, as though he were a marionette being guided by invisible strings. When his face came into view, my stomach dropped. His features were familiar, but distorted, his eyes sunken and dark, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones, and his smile, it wasn't human. It was too wide, too sharp, his lips curling upward in a way that made my skin crawl. "It's almost done," he said, his voice layered and echoing, as though it were coming from multiple places at once. Just a little longer. Soon edad tuvitsual habe kostiti. Rachel broke free from my grip, stepping toward him, despite the rising panic in her voice. Oh, Ethan, please. It's us. We can leave together. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out. Just come with us. His smile widened, and for a moment, the glow around him seemed to intensify. Leave, he repeated, his tone almost amused. There is no leaving. There never was. This place, it's not a prison. It's a door. Behind him, the walls began to shift, the smooth stone rippling like water. Shapes emerged, faces, just like the ones we'd seen before, their mouths open in silent screams. The light in the room dimmed, the glow around Ethan growing brighter, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to move on their own. We need to go, I said, my voice shaking. Then I grabbed Rachel's arm again, but she pulled away, her eyes fixed on Ethan. Rachel, we can't stay here. Look at him. He's not. I can't leave him, she snapped, turning to glare at me. Her eyes were filled with tears, her expression torn between fear and determination. I'm not abandoning him. The room began to tremble, the ground beneath us vibrating as cracks spiderwebbed across the floor. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, their voices overlapping until they became a deafening roar. Ethan tilted his head back, his arms outstretched, and the glow around him pulsed, the air shimmering with each wave of light. It's waking up, he said, his voice rising above the chaos. Do you feel it? It's here. I felt it. The pressure in the room grew unbearable. The air so thick, it felt like I was drowning. The walls seemed to close in, the faces pressing closer, their expressions twisted in agony. And then, from the cracks in the floor, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark, shifting mass that oozed upward, defying gravity. But as it grew, it began to take shape. Limbs stretched outward, impossibly long and thin, their surfaces glistening like oil. Dozens of eyes opened across its body, unblinking and cold, their gaze piercing through me like daggers. It was massive, its form stretching beyond the edges of the room, its presence overwhelming and suffocating. Rachel stumbled backward, her hands pressed to her mouth, her flashlight clattering to the floor. What is that? She whispered, her voice barely audible. It's everything, Ethan said, his smile never faltering. It's the beginning and the end. It's been waiting for us. The creature moved, slowly, deliberately, its limbs reaching out toward us. The whispers grew louder, sharper, cutting into my thoughts like shards of glass. I tried to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. The weight of the thing, of its presence, was too much, pinning me in place, my mind drowning in the chaos of its voice. Rachel screamed, the sound snapping me out of my paralysis. I grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the edge of the room, toward the only sliver of darkness that didn't seem to be consumed by the creature's light. She resisted at first, her gaze locked on Ethan, But when the creature's limb lashed out, shattering the floor where we'd just been standing, she followed. "We can't fight it," I shouted, my voice barely carrying over the roar of the whispers. "We have to go." Claire's absence hit me like a blow, but there was no time to think about it, no time to mourn. The room was collapsing around us, the walls crumbling, the ground splitting apart beneath our feet. The creature's limbs thrashed wildly, each movement shaking the chamber like an earthquake. Ethan stood in the center of it all, untouched, his arms raised as though in worship. "You can't run," he called after us, his voice distorted and hollow. "It will need you. It's already inside you." We reached the edge of the room, where a jagged opening in the wall revealed a narrow tunnel. I shoved Rachel through first, glancing back one last time at the scene behind us. The creature was fully formed now, its massive body filling the chamber, its eyes all fixed on me. Ethan stood before it, his back to us, his figure dwarfed by its size. And then the walls gave way, and the chamber disappeared into darkness. The tunnel was tight and suffocating, the air cold and stale. The whispers had faded, replaced by the sound of our ragged breathing and the occasional groan of shifting stone. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Every step forward felt heavier, the weight of what we'd seen pressing down on us like a physical force. After what felt like hours, the tunnel opened up into the forest. The air was sharp and cold, the light dim and gray. The trees loomed above us, their branches twisted and skeletal, blocking out the sky. For a moment, I thought we were safe, but then I heard it. The faint, familiar sound of whispers carried on the wind. Rachel collapsed to her knees, her hands pressed to her ears, her body shaking. I knelt beside her, my own hands trembling, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The forest was silent now, the whispers fading into the distance, but the weight of them lingered, an echo that I knew would never leave. "We're not out," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Are we?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew the truth. The forest wasn't a place. It was something else, something that had followed us, that would never let us go. And as the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of Ethan's laughter, I realized we had never really left at all. The air inside the Charter Street Cemetery was thick with the weight of centuries. It didn't matter that it was late October, or that the chill from the Atlantic seemed to settle deep into my bones. This place wasn't cold in the usual sense. It was the kind of cold that lingered in your chest, like something was pressing down on your lungs. The thin beam of my flashlight barely cut through the dense mist, curling around the gravestones, their weathered faces tilted at odd angles, as if even the earth itself wanted to spit them out. We had no business being there. Not that late, not in the dark. But the allure of Salem's stories, of curses and witches, of forgotten graves and lingering spirits, had pulled us in like moths to a flame. And now, standing in the shadow of some nameless crypt, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd made a mistake. A terrible, irreversible mistake. Rachel was the first to spot it, her flashlight catching the edge of something half buried beneath a cluster of broken stones near the far wall. I watched as she crouched, brushing away dirt and damp leaves, her breath fogging in the air. The rest of us stood back, the tension between us unspoken but palpable, as though we all silently hoped she wouldn't find anything. But she did. It was a book, small and bound in cracked leather, the surface etched with symbols I couldn't recognize. At first glance, it looked like a relic, the kind of thing you'd expect to see behind glass, in a museum. But as Rachel lifted it, the light from her flashlight seemed to catch on something else. A faint shimmer of red that ran along the edges of the pages, as though they'd been dipped in ink, or something darker. Yulil, don't open it, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. My voice sounded strange in the silence, too loud and too hollow, like it didn't belong to me. Rachel hesitated, her fingers brushing over the cover, but then she glanced back at me with a look that I recognized all too well. Curiosity and defiance, the twin engines that had driven every bad decision we'd ever made. The cover creaked as it opened, the sound impossibly loud against the quiet night. I felt the shift immediately. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gust of wind, no thunderclap in the distance, but the air changed, growing heavier, almost electric. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I might be imagining it. But then I saw the way the others shifted uneasily, their eyes darting toward the shadows around us. The pages were covered in handwriting, jagged and uneven, as though whoever had written them had been in a hurry or in pain. The words weren't in English. Hell, they didn't even look like words. They were shapes and lines, spiraling out across the page in patterns that made my head ache just to look at them. And then Rachel turned to the final page. The writing there was different, clearer. One phrase, scrawled over and over in what looked like deep crimson ink, so thick in places it had bled through the paper, the marked "Will Pay." Rachel's flashlight flickered, the light stuttering before cutting out completely. "Hebuluades," she cursed, shaking it. But the darkness didn't wait for her to fix it. It crept closer, swallowing the edges of the cemetery, the mist thickening until I could barely see the others. I turned, my own flashlight trembling in my hand, and caught a glimpse of Claire's face. She was pale, her eyes wide, and she was clutching her wrist like something had burned her. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice tight, but she didn't answer. Instead, she held up her hand, and I saw it, an angry red mark, circular and jagged, like it had been branded into her skin. The same mark that now burned on the inside of my own wrist. It wasn't just us. One by one, the others revealed the same mark, each identical, each impossibly fresh. I could feel it pulsing against my skin, hot and sharp, as though it were alive. A wave of nausea rolled over me, and I turned toward Rachel, who was still holding the book. "We need to put it back," I said, forcing the words out even as my throat tightened. "No." "Tony." Rachel didn't respond. Reese Ada didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the book, her face slack, her lips moving silently. It took me a moment to realize she was whispering something, her voice barely audible. I stepped closer, reaching for her shoulder, and that's when I saw the shadow. It wasn't hers. It couldn't be. It stretched too far, too high, its edges curling unnaturally against the mist. For a moment, I thought it might just be a trick of the light. But then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, reaching toward her. The scream caught in my throat as the shadow enveloped her, dragging her backward into the darkness. The book fell from her hands, landing with a dull thud on the wet ground, and the mist surged forward, closing the gap where she had stood. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, to do something, but my legs refused to move. The others were shouting, their voices panicked, but it all sounded distant, muffled, like I was underwater. And then the whispers started, soft at first, almost imperceptible, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. But they grew louder, sharper, their voices overlapping until I couldn't tell where one ended and another began. They weren't coming from the mist, or the shadows, or even the cemetery. They were inside my head, clawing at the edges of my thoughts, filling the spaces between my breaths. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering wildly, the beam cutting across the graves. Something moved in the corner of my vision, a figure, just barely visible through the fog. It was tall, too tall, its limbs stretched and jagged, its face obscured by shadows. I turned toward it, my heart hammering in my chest, and the whispers surged, a single word rising above the rest. Run, Paul, Tune, Omatelier, Sekos, Shonkan. We didn't stop running, not when the whispers surged into a deafening roar, not when the mist thickened into something suffocating, and not when the ground beneath our feet seemed to shift and ripple like a living thing. The cemetery blurred into darkness, the gravestones disappearing into the fog, their jagged shapes melting into indistinct shadows. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I couldn't stop, not with the sound of Rachel's scream still ringing in my ears. Not with that thing moving through the mist behind us. It wasn't just chasing us. It was playing with us, hurting us, pushing us towards some unseen end. I could feel it, the weight of its presence pressing down on me like an invisible hand, guiding my every step. We burst out of the cemetery onto the uneven cobblestones of the street, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. The town was quiet, unnaturally so, the kind of silence that felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. The glow from the streetlights barely pierced the mist, casting weak, flickering halos onto the empty sidewalks. Claire collapsed against a lamppost, clutching her knees, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. What the hell was that?" she choked out, her voice trembling. I couldn't answer. My thoughts were a jumbled mess. My mind stuck on the image of Rachel's shadow being swallowed whole. I wanted to believe she was still alive, that she was somewhere out there, waiting for us to find her. But the mark on my wrist pulsed, hot and sharp, and deep down I knew the truth. Rachel wasn't coming back. Mark stumbled to the edge of the sidewalk, dropping to his knees and retching into the gutter. His flashlight, now dim and flickering, rolled from his hand, coming to a stop at my feet. I picked it up, my fingers shaking as I turned it over in my hands. Envelop. The beam was weak, barely more than a glow, but it was better than nothing. "We have to keep moving," I said, my voice hoarse. The words felt hollow, like I was just saying them to fill the silence. "Whatever that thing is, it's not done." Claire straightened, wiping her face with the sleeve of her jacket. She didn't argue. None of us did. We were too scared, too shaken to think of anything else but putting distance between ourselves and the cemetery. But as we turned onto the main street, the reality of our situation sank in. Salem wasn't right. The quaint, historic town we'd wandered through earlier that day was gone, replaced by something colder, darker. The storefronts, usually lit with displays of witch-themed souvenirs and Halloween decorations, were dark and empty, their windows reflecting nothing but our pale, frightened faces. The streets stretched endlessly, their familiar turns and landmarks replaced by unfamiliar alleys and dead ends. It was like the town had shifted, twisted into something unrecognizable. "We're not in Salem anymore," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark laughed bitterly. A harsh, broken sound that made my stomach churn. "Then where the hell are?" he snapped, his voice rising. "Because I'm pretty sure I didn't sign up for this freak show." The whispers returned, faint and teasing, weaving through the air like a forgotten melody. My pulse quickened, and I spun around, shining the flashlight into the mist. The beam wavered, catching glimpses of movement just beyond the edges of the light, shadows slipping between the buildings, too fast to make out, but too real to ignore. "Don't stop," I said, grabbing Claire's arm and pulling her forward. "We have to keep going." But going where? Every street looked the same, every turn leading us deeper into a maze of mist and shadows. The ground beneath us felt wrong, the cobblestones uneven and slick, like they were shifting beneath our feet. The town seemed to stretch and bend, the buildings leaning inward as though watching us. Then we saw it, a faint light in the distance, barely visible through the fog. And it flickered like a candle, warm and inviting, a beacon in the darkness. Without thinking, we moved toward it, our steps quickening despite the dread curling in my stomach. The light led us to a small building, its wooden walls weathered and warped, its windows dark and empty. A sign hung crookedly above the door, the paint faded and peeling, but the words were still legible. "The Witch's Rest." "This is a bad idea," Claire muttered. But she followed us inside anyway. The air inside the tavern was stale, heavy with the scent of old wood and something metallic. The tables were empty, the chairs scattered haphazardly across the floor, as though whoever had been there last had left in a hurry. The only source of light came from a single lantern sitting on the bar, its flame flickering weakly. Mark moved toward the bar, his flashlight sweeping across the room. Edward stood and "Hello," he called, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Is anyone here?" The whispers answered him. They weren't coming from outside this time. They were here, inside the tavern, curling around us like smoke. The lantern flickered, its light dimming, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, deeper. I gripped my flashlight tightly, my knuckles white, and scanned the room, searching for the source. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the room, near the fireplace, was a figure. It was barely visible, its outline blurred and indistinct, as though it were part of the shadows themselves. But its eyes burned like embers, bright and hungry, fixed on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "It's her," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "The witch." The figure moved, its limbs stretching unnaturally, its form bending and twisting as it stepped closer. The whispers grew louder, sharper, filling the room with a cacophony of voices that made my head throb. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hands, and collided with Mark, who was frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror. The witch stopped just short of the lantern, her fiery gaze fixed on the book in Mark's hand. I hadn't even realized he was holding it, but now it was glowing faintly, the symbols on its cover pulsing with the same red light that had marked our wrists. "You shouldn't have taken it," she said, her voice low and guttural, layered with 1,000 echoes. "You brought it back. You brought me back." The lantern's flame went out. The darkness wasn't just a lack of light. It had weight, an oppressive force that pressed down on my chest and stole the air from my lungs. The whispers didn't fade with the extinguished lantern. They swelled, filling the space until it felt like they were clawing at my skull. My flashlight flickered weakly, the beam barely piercing the blackness. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the wooden floorboards. They weren't ours. My breath caught, and I strained to see through the gloom. But the shadows seemed alive, shifting and writhing, hiding whatever was coming closer. "Don't move," Claire whispered. Though her voice was so faint, it was almost swallowed by the whispers. I couldn't have moved, even if I wanted to. Even as I wanted to. My legs felt rooted to the spot. Every muscle in my body locked in place as the sound grew louder, closer. A faint glow appeared ahead, barely visible, like a dying ember floating in the darkness. It wasn't enough to illuminate the room, but I could see the outline of the figure again, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs bending at unnatural angles as it moved. The glow wasn't coming from the figure itself, but from the floor beneath it. Symbols etched into the wood, began to burn with a faint crimson light, spreading outward in jagged lines that pulsed like a heartbeat. Mark was the first to react. He stumbled backward, dropping the book with a thud that seemed to echo endlessly. The figure stopped abruptly, its head tilting toward the sound. I couldn't see its face, not clearly, but I felt its gaze, sharp and piercing, like it was looking through me, into the darkest corners of my mind. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said. Its voice was layered, distorted, 1,000 whispers speaking in unison. The sound made my skin crawl, every instinct screaming at me to run. But where? The tavern had become a prison, the walls pressing inward, the air growing colder with every passing second. The figure stepped closer, and for the first time I saw its face. It wasn't human, at least not anymore. Its features were gaunt, the skin stretched tight over its skull, its eyes hollow sockets that burned with that same crimson light, its mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile, though it was too wide, too sharp, its teeth jagged and uneven. "You took what was mine," it said, the words reverberating through the room. "And now you're marked." My wrist burned suddenly, the mark flaring to life with a searing pain that brought me to my knees. I clutched at it, but the heat didn't subside. It spread, crawling up my arm like fire, sinking into my veins. Around me, the others cried out, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of pain and fear. The figure raised one skeletal hand, its fingers impossibly long, tipped with nails that looked more like claws. It pointed toward the book, its smile widening. "Return it," it said, "or I will take it from you." Mark scrambled toward the book, his hands trembling as he grabbed it from the floor. But as he lifted it, the symbols etched into its cover began to glow, brighter and brighter, until the entire room was bathed in a crimson light. The figure recoiled, hissing, its form flickering like a dying flame. "Don't give it to her," Claire shouted, her voice breaking through the chaos. She was on her feet now, her face pale but resolute. "It's not just a book. It's her anchor. If we give it back, she'll finish whatever she started." The figure turned its gaze to Claire, and for a moment, the light in the room seemed to dim. "You think you understand," it said, its tone laced with venom. "You have no idea what you've awakened." "Ah, so will you this day." The floor trembled beneath us, the symbols burning brighter, their lines spreading outward until they covered every surface. The whispers reached a deafening pitch, overlapping until they became one continuous, mind-numbing hum. My vision blurred, the edges of the room twisting and warping, and I felt the pull of something beyond, a darkness deeper than anything I could comprehend, tugging at the edges of my soul. Mark screamed, clutching the book to his chest as the light around him grew brighter, hotter. The figure lunged toward him, its movements jerky and unnatural, its clawed hands outstretched. I didn't think. I grabbed a chair, the closest thing I could find, and swung it as hard as I could. The impact didn't stop it. The figure barely flinched as the chair shattered against its back, but it gave Mark enough time to move, stumbling toward the door, the book still clutched tightly in his hands. "We have to get out of here," he shouted, his voice hoarse. Claire grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door as the figure turned its attention to us. Its eyes burned brighter, its smile widening into something inhuman, and the room seemed to fold in on itself, the walls bending and twisting as though the tavern were alive. We burst through the door into the cold night air, the mist curling around us like smoke. The whispers didn't stop. They followed us, louder and more aggressive, pushing against my thoughts like an invading force. The street stretched endlessly before us, the familiar landmarks of Salem gone, replaced by a labyrinth of shadows and fog. Mark was ahead of us, his movements frantic, the book glowing faintly in his hands. "We have to destroy it," he said, his voice shaking. "It's the only way to stop her." "Shoo, Edel, Gani, how?" I shouted, barely able to hear myself over the whispers. "We don't even know what it is." The ground beneath us trembled, the cobblestones cracking and splintering as the light from the book intensified. I could feel it now, the presence of something vast and ancient, something that had been waiting, watching, for centuries. And it was angry. The fog parted suddenly, revealing a narrow alleyway that seemed to pulse with its own faint crimson glow. Mark hesitated, glancing back at us, and in that moment the figure emerged from the mist behind him. It moved faster now, its limbs bending and contorting as it closed the distance. Mark turned, his eyes wide with terror, but he didn't run. Instead, he held the book out in front of him, the symbols on its cover blazing like fire. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice trembled. The figure stopped, its form flickering as the light from the book grew brighter. For a moment I thought it might work, that the book might actually repel it, but then the figure laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "You think that will save you," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "You can't escape what you've become." The ground beneath Mark cracked, the cobblestones splitting apart as a dark, oozing substance seeped up from below. It wrapped around his legs, pulling him down, and the book fell from his hands, landing with a dull thud. I reached for him, but Claire grabbed my arm, her grip iron tight. "We can't save him," she said, her voice breaking. "It's too late." Mark's screams echoed through the fog as the darkness consumed him, dragging him into the abyss. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the ground stilled. The whispers faded, leaving behind a silence so absolute it was deafening. The book lay on the ground, its glow now faint and flickering, like a dying ember. I stared at it, my chest heaving, my mind reeling, and for the first time I realized the truth. We weren't fighting the witch. We were feeding her. The silence that followed was worse than the whispers. It pressed against my ears, my chest, as though the world itself had taken a deep breath and refused to exhale. The mist hung heavy in the air, thicker now, clinging to my skin like damp cloth. The book lay at my feet, its glow dim and erratic, casting faint red shadows across the shattered cobblestone. Claire stood beside me, her face pale, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Neither of us moved. Neither of us dared. The ground where Mark had been just moments ago was still. The black, oozing substance that had claimed him now hardened and cracked like dried blood. His screams were gone, swallowed by the void, but the echo of them lingered, seared into my mind. The book pulsed once, a weak, dying throb, and I felt it deep in my chest. A tug, a pull, like it was calling me. My gaze dropped to it, and for a moment I thought I saw the symbols on its cover shift, rearranging themselves into something new, something worse. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to look away, but the sensation didn't stop. The pull grew stronger, digging into my thoughts, into my very soul. "We can't leave it here," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were fixed on the book, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. "If we leave it, she'll take it." "And if we take it?" I asked, my voice hoarse, raw. "What then?" "It's killing us, Claire, one by one. Mark, Rachel, I can't..." My voice broke, and I swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "I can't carry it." Claire knelt, her hand hovering over the book. For a moment, I thought she might pick it up, but instead, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a scrap of cloth. She wrapped it around her hand before carefully lifting the book, holding it as though it might bite. The faint glow seeped through the fabric, staining it red, and I saw her wince as though it burned her. "We don't have a choice," she said, standing. Her hand trembled as she cradled the book against her chest. "She wants this. If we have it, maybe we can stop her." "Stop her how?" I snapped, the frustration bubbling to the surface. "We don't even know what she is. We don't know what this is." Claire didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth was, she was right. We didn't have a choice. Fine. We didn't have a choice. Leaving the book here felt like leaving a door wide open, inviting whatever was waiting on the other side to step through. The streets around us were no longer recognizable. The mist had swallowed the town, erasing every familiar landmark, every shred of normalcy. The buildings leaned at impossible angles, their windows dark and empty, like vacant eyes watching our every move. The cobblestones beneath our feet felt uneven, as though they were shifting with each step, guiding us towards something unseen. We walked in silence, the weight of the book, and everything that had happened, pressing down on us like a physical force. My wrist still burned where the mark had flared, the skin raw and tender. I couldn't stop thinking about Mark, about the way he'd screamed, the way the darkness had swallowed him whole. I kept expecting to hear his voice, to turn and see him standing behind us, his face twisted into something unrecognizable. But the only sound was the crunch of our footsteps on the uneven ground, and the faint, rhythmic pulse of the book. The mist parted suddenly, revealing a building ahead. It was small, almost unassuming, its wooden walls weathered and cracked, its roof sagging under the weight of centuries. The windows were boarded up, the door slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Something about it felt familiar, though I couldn't place why. The glow from the book grew brighter as we approached, as though it recognized the place, and a chill ran down my spine. "We're supposed to be here," Claire said, her voice hollow. I wanted to argue, to say that we shouldn't go inside, that we should turn around and run as far and as fast as we could. But I didn't, because deep down, I knew she was right. The pull of the book, the way the mist seemed to guide us, it had all led here. Whatever was waiting inside, we couldn't escape it. Not anymore. Anymore. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty space beyond. The interior was dark, the air stale and heavy, carrying the faint scent of decay. My flashlight flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor, and I felt my chest tighten as I stepped inside. The walls were covered in symbols, etched deep into the wood, their lines sharp and chaotic, twisting into shapes that made my head ache just to look at them. At the center of the room was an altar, crudely constructed from stone and wood, its surface stained with something dark and sticky. The book pulsed again, its glow lighting up the room, and I saw them. Candles arranged in a circle around the altar, their flames flickering weakly despite the absence of wind. The air was thick with something I couldn't name, something that made my skin crawl and my stomach churn. "She's here," Claire whispered, clutching the book tighter. Her knuckles were white, her face pale, but her voice was steady. "This is where it started. This is where we end it." "How?" My voice was sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't care. "How do we stop her? Do you even know?" Claire turned to face me, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and determination. "We have to use it," she said, holding up the book. "It's not just hers, it's ours now. It marked us, but that means we can use it. We can turn it against her." Before I could respond, the whispers returned, louder this time, filling the room like a rising tide. The candles flickered, their flames stretching unnaturally high, casting wild, dancing shadows across the walls. The air grew colder, the light from the book flickering like a heartbeat, and I felt it again, that presence, vast and ancient, pressing down on us from all sides. The shadows in the room began to move, pulling away from the walls, coalescing into a single, towering shape. The air around it shimmered, and I felt my knees buckle as it stepped closer, its form indistinct but undeniably human. The glow from the book grew brighter, and for a moment I thought I saw a face, thin, gaunt, its hollow eyes burning with a fiery red light. "You can't stop me," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through my very bones. "You opened the door. You let me in." Claire stepped forward, holding the book out in front of her like a shield. "We didn't let you in," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "We're closing it." The figure laughed, a harsh, grating sound that made my skin crawl. "You think you can stop me? You are nothing. Less than nothing." The room trembled, the floorboards creaking and splintering as the shadows surged forward. And then the light from the book exploded, filling the room with a blinding red glow. The light from the book poured out like liquid fire, spilling across the floor and walls, casting the room in a pulsating crimson glow. The shadows recoiled, retreating momentarily, their jagged edges twisting and writhing as if in pain. The air vibrated with a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. All at once, my ears rang, my thoughts tangled in static, but I could still feel it, the thing in the room with us. It wasn't gone. It was waiting. Claire held the book aloft, her face pale and drawn, beads of sweat trailing down her temples. Marks on her wrist glowed faintly, their lines sharp and jagged, pulsing in time with the book. She didn't look at me, didn't say a word. Her focus was entirely on the thing in front of us, the shadow that had begun to take form once again. "It's not enough," she said through gritted teeth, her voice strained. "The book, there's more to it. We have to finish what it started." I didn't understand what she meant, but I didn't have time to ask. The shadow surged forward, its edges sharpening, its shape twisting into something almost human but wrong in ways I couldn't put into words. Limbs too long, a head that seemed to split and reform with every movement, and those eyes, burning, unblinking, filled with a hatred so pure. It made my stomach churn. The room trembled as the figure lashed out, one of its limbs crashing against the floorboards with a deafening crack. The impact sent shards of wood flying, and I stumbled back, barely catching myself against the altar. My flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam flickering weakly before dying out entirely. "Claire, we have to leave," I shouted, my voice hoarse. But she didn't move. She was rooted in place, her grip on the book tightening as the shadow loomed over her. Its limbs stretched toward her, curling like claws, and the air around her shimmered with an oppressive heat. "Say the words," Claire screamed, her voice breaking. "The words in the book, they're the key." The book. My mind raced as I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and pointing it at the altar where the book still pulsed with its unholy glow. I didn't want to touch it. The thought of it, the memory of the burning heat it radiated, made my skin crawl. But Claire was right. There was no other way. Whatever power the book held, it was the only thing keeping that thing from tearing us apart. I reached out, my hand trembling, and grasped the edge of the book. The moment my fingers touched the cover, a wave of heat shot up my arm, searing my skin, but I didn't let go. I flipped it open, the pages glowing faintly, the jagged symbols burning themselves into my vision. They weren't words, not in any language I understood, but they seemed to pulse with an energy that was alive, almost sentient. "Read it," Claire shouted, her voice desperate. "Just to read it." The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a cacophony of voices that filled the room. They clawed at my thoughts, pulling at my focus, but I forced myself to look at the page, to form the shapes with my mouth, even though they felt like poison on my tongue. The words, or whatever they were, spilled out of me in a low, guttural chant, the sound foreign and unnatural. With each syllable, the room seemed to shift, the air growing heavier, the light from the book brighter. The shadow writhed and twisted, its form flickering like a dying flame, its movements more erratic. "You don't understand," the shadow hissed, its voice layered and distorted. "You think you can control it, but it will consume you, just as it consumed me." The ground beneath us cracked, deep fissures splitting the floorboards, revealing a dark, swirling void beneath. The light from the book seemed to feed the void, pulling at the edges of reality itself, bending and warping the space around us. I felt the pull, a deep, insistent tug that made my legs weak, my grip on the book faltering. "Don't stop," Claire cried, stepping closer, her hands outstretched as though she could shield me from the shadow's reach. "You're almost there." The marks on my wrist burned like fire, the pain searing up my arm and into my chest. The words came faster now, spilling from my lips in a torrent. I couldn't stop, even if I wanted to. The book burned in my hands, the pages writhing as though alive. But I held on, forcing the words out even as the shadows closed in. The figure let out a sound, a guttural, ear-splitting wail that shook the walls and sent a wave of cold air rushing through the room. Its form began to dissolve, its limbs unraveling like threads, its edges blurring into the darkness. The fissures in the floor widened, the void pulling at the shadow, at the book, at us. And then, with a final deafening scream, the shadow was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Ambiance. The room was still, the air heavy with the lingering scent of smoke and burnt wood. The book lay in my hands, its glow dimming until it was nothing more than an ordinary, lifeless object. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on me. Claire knelt beside me, her face pale but resolute. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cover of the book. "It's not over," she said, her voice barely a whisper. This isn't the end." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that it was over, that we had won. But deep down, I knew she was right. The marks on my wrist still burned, faint but persistent, and the air around us still felt heavy, charged with an energy that didn't belong to this world. As we stepped out of the building and into the misty night, the world around us seemed unchanged. The streets were empty, the buildings dark and silent, but the mist was thicker now, the shadows longer, and the whispers had never truly left. The mist didn't just follow us, it wrapped around us, clinging to every breath, every step, every thought. It was thicker now, almost suffocating, and the shadows that flickered at the edges of my vision felt closer, more alive. The book was heavy in my hands, its once blinding glow reduced to a faint, rhythmic pulse that matched the dull ache in my wrist. It felt like it was waiting, like it knew something I didn't. Claire walked a few steps ahead of me, her figure barely visible through the haze. She moved with a sense of purpose, her shoulders squared, but I could see the tremble in her hands, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder. She was scared. We both were, but neither of us said it. There wasn't any point. The town around us was unrecognizable. The cobblestone streets we'd walked earlier that day were gone, replaced by a cracked, uneven surface that shifted beneath our feet. The buildings loomed higher now, their shapes distorted, their windows dark and empty. The air smelled of ash and decay, thick and cloying, filling my lungs with every breath. I didn't know where we were, but it wasn't Salem. Not anymore. Leaves way down every Kyle. I'd show guys too. We're running out of time, Claire said suddenly, her voice breaking the heavy silence. She didn't look back, but her words were tight, strained. The marks, they're spreading. I glanced down at my wrist and froze. She was right. The jagged lines of the mark had grown, twisting up my forearm in sharp, angry patterns. They pulsed faintly, a dull red glow that matched the rhythm of the book. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, colder than the mist, and for a moment I couldn't move. It's not just us, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest, sharp and sudden. This place, it's changing everything. Claire didn't respond. She just kept walking, her steps quickening, her movements more frantic. I stumbled after her, clutching the book to my chest, my thoughts racing. Every part of me wanted to throw it away, to leave it behind and run, but I couldn't. It wouldn't let me. Its pull was stronger now, more insistent, like it was alive, like it needed me. The mist began to thin, just slightly, and I saw it, a house, standing alone at the end of the street. It was old, its wooden frame warped and sagging, the paint peeling away in long strips. The windows were shattered, the front door hanging from its hinges, but it still felt significant, like it was waiting for us. Claire stopped in front of the house, her breath visible in the cold night air. She didn't speak, didn't move, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fists clenched and unclenched at her sides. She was as reluctant to go inside as I was. But we both knew we didn't have a choice. The book pulsed in my hands, its light growing stronger, casting long shadows across the cracked ground. I stepped forward, the sound of my boots on the uneven surface impossibly loud, and pushed the door open. It creaked, the sound echoing into the emptiness beyond. And for a moment, I hesitated. But Claire was right behind me, her hand on my shoulder, and together we stepped inside. The air was colder here, thicker, and the smell of ash was overwhelming. The floor was covered in a thin layer of dust, disturbed only by the faint outlines of footprints leading deeper into the house. The walls were bare, their surfaces blackened and charred, as though a fire had gutted the place long ago. But it wasn't empty. The whispers were here, faint and distant, threading through the silence like a forgotten melody. Claire moved ahead of me, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. Wild. The beam flickered, the light weak and unsteady, but it was enough to illuminate the symbols etched into the walls. They were the same as the ones in the book, sharp and jagged, their lines twisting into shapes that hurt my eyes. I couldn't look at them for too long without feeling a dull ache in my skull. But I couldn't ignore them either. They were everywhere, covering every surface, growing more chaotic the deeper we went. "This is it," Claire said, her voice barely audible. "This is where it started." I didn't ask her how she knew. I didn't need to. The book's pull was stronger now, almost unbearable, and I felt it guiding me, leading me toward something I couldn't see but knew was waiting. My pulse quickened, the mark on my wrist burning like fire, and I stumbled forward, barely noticing as the floor beneath me shifted. The hallway opened into a large room, its ceiling high and arched, its walls covered in symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. At the center of the room was a circle, carved deep into the floor, its edges lined with candles that burned with an unnatural, flickering light. The air was thick with energy, humming and vibrating, and I felt it crawling across my skin, sinking into my bones. Claire stopped at the edge of the circle, her expression unreadable. "This is it," she said again, her voice trembling. "This is where we end it." The book pulsed in my hands, its light growing brighter, and I felt a surge of fear, sharp and unrelenting. The marks on my wrist flared, their lines spreading further up my arm, and I stumbled back, clutching at the burning skin. The pain was unbearable, searing through me like a blade, but I couldn't let go of the book. It wouldn't let me. The shadows in the room began to move, pulling away from the walls, coalescing into a single, towering shape. The air around it shimmered, and I felt my knees buckle as it stepped forward, its form flickering and unstable. Its eyes burned with that same crimson light, unblinking and cold, and its voice filled the room, low and guttural. "You think you can stop me?" it said, its tone dripping with malice. "You are nothing. Less than nothing." The candles flared, their flames stretching high, and the shadows surged forward, closing in around us. Claire grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the center of the circle, and the book in my hands blazed, its light filling the room with a blinding, searing heat. "Say," Claire screamed, her voice desperate. Say the words. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. The words spilled from my lips, guttural and foreign, their sound reverberating through the room. The light from the book grew brighter, the symbols on the walls flaring to life, and the shadows screamed, their voices echoing in a deafening cacophony. The ground beneath us cracked, splitting open, and I felt the pull of the void once again, stronger this time, more insistent. The shadow twisted and writhed, its form unraveling, and for a moment I thought we'd won, but then it laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "You can't escape me," it said, its voice echoing in the stillness. "I am already inside you." The laughter didn't fade. It hung in the air, sharp and jagged, cutting through the thick hum of energy that filled the room. My ears rang, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. The light from the book was blinding now, spilling across the walls and floor, illuminating every jagged symbol, every crack in the foundation. But it wasn't enough. "You, Samuel, Tiwani, Yilbedish." Begged. I could feel the truth in its voice, cold and undeniable. It was inside us, inside me. Its presence coiled in the darkest corners of my mind. Claire was shouting, her voice muffled, distant, as though the air around her had thickened into something impenetrable. Her hands were on my shoulders, shaking me. But I couldn't focus on her. The marks on my wrist burned brighter, spreading up my arm in sharp, angular lines that glowed like molten steel. The pain was unbearable, but I couldn't let go of the book. It held me as much as I held it, its pulsing light matching the erratic thrum of my heartbeat. The shadow loomed above us, its form unraveling and reforming in a constant, chaotic loop. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, splitting and twisting, its burning eyes locked onto mine. The room trembled as it stepped closer, its voice a low, resonant growl that vibrated through my bones. "You cannot destroy me," it said, its words reverberating through the space. "I am the beginning and the end. The door is open, and you cannot close it." The ground beneath me cracked, deep fissures spreading outward from the circle, glowing with the same searing red light as the book. The air was electric, heavy with the weight of something ancient and powerful. My knees buckled and I fell, the book slipping from my hands and landing with a dull thud in the center of the circle. Its light dimmed for a moment, as though it too were faltering. "No," Claire screamed, dropping to her knees beside me. Her hands reached for the book, but the light surged again, flaring so brightly it forced her back. She shielded her eyes, her face twisted with pain and frustration. "You have to finish it. You have to end this." I shook my head, my vision blurring, my thoughts fractured and jumbled. "I can't," I gasped, my voice barely audible. "It's too strong. It's..." The shadow's laughter cut me off, louder now, more triumphant. It stretched its limbs wide, its form expanding, filling the room with a suffocating darkness. The marks on my skin burned hotter, their lines spreading across my chest, my neck, until I could feel them crawling up my throat. I clutched at them, clawing at my skin, but it was no use. It was already inside me. It had always been inside me. Entered to me. You were never meant to win, it said, its voice a whisper and a roar all at once. You are nothing more than a vessel. A sacrifice. No, Claire said, her voice trembling but defiant. She rose to her feet, her hands balled into fists, her eyes blazing with determination. You don't get to decide how this ends. Before I could stop her, she stepped into the circle, her movements slow and deliberate. The light from the book flared again, brighter than ever, and for a moment I thought it might consume her. But she didn't falter. She knelt, her hands hovering over the book, and began to speak. Her voice was steady, strong, the words flowing from her lips, in a language I couldn't understand. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, their lines shifting and twisting in time with her chant. The room trembled, the ground splitting open beneath the shadow, and I saw it recoil, its form flickering like a dying flame. No, it roared, its voice filled with rage. You cannot bind me. You cannot undo what has been done. But Claire didn't stop. Her voice grew louder, her chant more forceful, and the light from the book surged outward, filling the room with a searing, all-consuming brilliance. The shadow writhed, its form collapsing in on itself, its burning eyes fading into the void. The marks on my skin burned hotter, their glow matching the light of the book, and I felt a sudden sharp pull, like something was being ripped from my very soul. I screamed, the sound raw and guttural, as the shadow's presence tore free from my mind. The pain was excruciating, but then it was gone, leaving behind an empty, hollow silence. The light dimmed, the room falling into darkness once more. The book lay still in the center of the circle, its glow extinguished, its pages blackened and curling at the edges. The symbols on the walls faded, their lines dissolving into nothingness, and the air grew still, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Claire collapsed beside me, her breathing shallow, her face pale and drawn. I reached for her, my hands trembling, but she managed a weak smile, her eyes filled with relief. "It's over," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We did it." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to tell her she was right, that we'd won, that it was finished. But as I looked around the room, at the blackened walls and the faint, lingering mist that curled at the edges of the circle, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us, waiting. I helped Claire to her feet, and together we stumbled out of the house and into the cold night air. The mist was thinner now, the streets quiet and empty, but the silence felt wrong. The marks on my skin were fading, their glow extinguished, but the ache remained, a dull, persistent reminder of what had happened. We didn't speak as we walked, our footsteps echoing against the cracked cobblestones. The town around us was still unrecognizable, its streets twisting and bending in ways that didn't make sense. I couldn't tell if we were moving closer to home or farther away, but it didn't matter. We just kept moving, hoping that if we walked far enough, fast enough, we might leave it all behind. But deep down, I knew the truth. The book was gone, the shadow defeated, but the marks remained. The whispers, faint and distant, still lingered at the edges of my mind, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. And as the first light of dawn broke through the mist, I realized we hadn't escaped. We'd only just begun. The cabin sat at the edge of the world, or at least it felt that way. The dense wall of trees loomed around it, their skeletal branches reaching skyward like black veins against the deepening dusk. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, thick with the weight of autumn, and every step toward the cabin felt like a mistake. We should have turned back the moment we arrived at Red Pines, but curiosity had led us here. And now it was too late. The wooden structure was smaller than I'd imagined, its warped boards barely holding together, patches of moss clinging to its edges like a parasite feeding on the rot. I could see the faintest trail of smoke curling from the crooked chimney, and the single window to the right of the door reflected the dying light of the sun, though there was no one inside to light it. I didn't want to be here. None of us did. But we had come too far to let fear pull us away now. Inside, the air was colder than it had any right to be. Colder than it was outside. The fire in the small stone hearth burned weakly, its flames struggling to cast enough light to push back the darkness that clung to the corners of the room. Dust coated every surface, the kind of dust that felt ancient, untouched, as if time had forgotten this place. It smelled wrong, not just of damp wood and smoke, but something sharper, something metallic. I ran my flashlight over the walls, the light bouncing off jagged carvings etched deep into the wood. They weren't random scratches. They were deliberate, angular, forming patterns I couldn't begin to understand. They stretched from the floor to the ceiling, every inch of the cabin covered in these strange, chaotic symbols. My chest tightened, and I felt the first threads of unease pulling at the edges of my thoughts. The others fanned out, their movements slow and careful, as though any sudden noise might wake something lurking just out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even though I knew the cabin was empty. There was something oppressive about the air, something that pressed against my chest and made it hard to breathe. It wasn't just the cold. It was the sense that the space itself didn't want us there. In the corner of the room, partially obscured by a tattered, moth-eaten rug, we found it. A trapdoor. The wood was darker here, stained with something that had soaked into the grain and refused to fade with time. The edges of the door were worn, the iron ring at its center rusted, as though it hadn't been opened in decades. But it wasn't the age of it that stopped me from reaching for it. It was the symbols, the same ones carved into the walls, etched deeper into the wood of the door, so precise and sharp they almost seemed to vibrate. I crouched, my hand hovering over the ring, and felt the chill radiating from the seams of the trapdoor. It wasn't just cold, it was raw, the kind of wrong that made my skin crawl and my stomach churn. I didn't want to open it. Every part of me screamed to leave it alone, to step away and forget it existed. But I couldn't. Something pulled at me, a force I couldn't name, couldn't fight, drawing me closer. The first creak of the hinges echoed through the cabin, louder than it should have been, like the sound itself carried weight. The air that rushed up from below was ice cold, biting, and it carried with it the faintest hint of rot. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through the thick, swirling dust, and revealed a narrow staircase descending into the void. The others gathered behind me, their breathing shallow, their flashlights trembling in their hands. No one spoke. No one had to. We all felt it, the pull, the dread, the sense that we had just stepped over a threshold we could never return from. The trapdoor wasn't just a door. It was a boundary, and whatever lay beneath it was something that had been waiting a very, very long time. The staircase groaned beneath our weight as we descended, the sound hollow and brittle, like bones ready to snap. The air grew colder with every step, and the smell of rot grew stronger, almost choking. My flashlight flickered, its beam weak and unsteady, and I tightened my grip, willing it to stay on. The darkness here was different, thicker, heavier, as though it had substance. It clung to my skin, seeped into my clothes, and made every breath a struggle. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a small chamber. The walls were stone, rough and uneven, their surfaces blackened as though scorched by fire. The symbols were here too, carved deep into the stone, their jagged lines glowing faintly with a sickly pulsating light. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, low and wide, its surface slick with something dark that reflected the light of our flashlights. My stomach turned as I stepped closer, the smell of blood overwhelming now, sharp and metallic, mingling with the stench of decay. The pedestal wasn't just stained, it was wet. The liquid pooled in its shallow grooves, dripping down the sides in sluggish, viscous streams that seemed to defy gravity. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to be anywhere near it, but the pull was stronger here, more insistent. As I reached the pedestal, my flashlight caught something on its surface. A book. Its cover was blackened and warped, the leather cracked and curling at the edges, as though it had been burned. Symbols adorned its cover, their jagged lines matching those on the walls, and the faint glow seemed to pulse in time with the marks on my wrist. I didn't remember reaching for it, didn't remember touching it, but suddenly it was in my hands, heavier than it should have been, the leather rough and warm against my skin. The moment I held it, the light from the symbols flared, and the room seemed to shift around me. The air grew thicker, the shadows deeper, and the sound of whispers began to fill the chamber. The whispers weren't loud, but they were constant, threading through the air like a melody just out of reach. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt them sink into my thoughts, twisting and pulling, stirring something deep and primal inside me. My hands trembled, the book almost slipping from my grasp, and I forced myself to look away, to focus on anything but the suffocating pull of its pages. That's when I saw them, the faces in the walls. They weren't carvings, not like the symbols. They were real, their features contorted and frozen in silent screams, their eyes wide and unblinking, their mouths open in terror. They stared at me, their expressions etched with agony, and I realized with a sickening certainty that they weren't just faces. They were warnings. And we had ignored them. The faces in the walls didn't move, but they felt alive. Their hollow eyes seemed to follow me as I turned, my flashlight flickering against the jagged contours of their frozen expressions. My hands gripped the book tighter, the weight of it pulling against my arms, as though it were trying to anchor me to the ground. The whispers grew louder, threading through the silence like smoke, curling into my thoughts and unraveling them. Behind me, Claire whispered my name. Her voice trembled, barely audible over the hum of the symbols that now pulsed on every surface. I turned to see her standing at the edge of the chamber, her flashlight trembling in her hand, her face pale and drawn. She was staring at the pedestal, her eyes wide with something between awe and terror. "What is it?" she asked, though the question didn't feel directed at me. Her gaze flicked to the book in my hands, and I saw her take an involuntary step back, as though the sight of it alone was enough to unsettle her. I wanted to tell her I didn't know, that I couldn't explain the pull, the whispers, the feeling that the room itself was alive. But the words wouldn't come. I couldn't make sense of anything. The air grew colder, sharper, and I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, like static electricity building just beneath the surface of my skin. The faint glow of the symbols on the walls brightened, their jagged lines shifting, twisting into new shapes that I couldn't comprehend. My stomach churned as I watched them, the patterns swimming in and out of focus like they were alive, like they were breathing. The whispers shifted, their tone rising and falling, as though they were speaking a language I didn't understand, but could feel in my bones. It wasn't just sound, it was pressure, waves of it, sinking into my chest, wrapping around my ribs, clawing at my lungs. My heart raced, each beat hammering against my ribs, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the book as the weight of it became unbearable. Then I heard it, a voice, soft and low, threading through the chaos like a blade cutting through cloth. It wasn't one of us. It was something else, something deeper, older, and it was calling my name. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was faint at first, almost indistinct, but it grew louder with each passing second, its tone smooth and deliberate, each syllable dripping with intent. It wasn't shouting. It didn't need to. The sound of it filled the chamber, reverberating off the walls, wrapping around me like smoke. I didn't understand the words, but they felt intimate, like they were meant for me, alone. "Do you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. She was looking at me now, her expression etched with fear. "What's it saying?" I couldn't answer. The voice was everywhere, inside the walls, inside my head, twisting and coiling through my thoughts. It wasn't speaking to all of us. It was speaking to me. The symbols flared brighter, their light bathing the chamber in a sickly red glow. The walls seemed to close in, the faces stretching and contorting, their mouths opening wider, their screams silent but palpable. The pedestal trembled, a low rhythmic hum vibrating through the floor, and the book in my hands grew hotter, its edges burning against my palms. Claire reached for me, her hand brushing against my arm, but I jerked away, the movement almost instinctive. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and I felt my legs move without my permission, pulling me toward the center of the circle carved into the floor. I didn't want to go, didn't want to step closer to the pedestal, but I couldn't stop myself. The pull was too strong. As I stepped into the circle, the air shifted. It was subtle at first, like the faintest change in pressure, but it grew quickly, the energy in the room tightening around me like a noose. The whispers rose to a crescendo, overlapping in a chaotic symphony, and the symbols on the walls flared with a light so bright it burned the edges of my vision. The floor beneath me groaned, deep cracks spider-webbing out from the pedestal, and I felt a sudden rush of heat, like fire racing up my spine. The voice was louder now, its tone sharp and commanding, but it was no longer calling my name. It was demanding something I couldn't understand, but felt compelled to obey. Claire was shouting, her voice breaking through the noise, but her words were drowned out by the roar of the chamber itself. The walls trembled, the faces dissolving into the stone, their expressions stretching into long, jagged lines that merged with the symbols. The book in my hands burned hotter, the leather curling beneath my fingers, and I could feel it now. The presence. It wasn't just in the room. It was here with us, around us, inside us. The pedestal cracked, its surface splitting open to reveal a dark, swirling void beneath. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath cutting into my lungs like shards of glass. The glow from the symbols flickered, their light fading and returning in irregular bursts, and I felt the ground beneath my feet shift, tilting toward the center of the circle. The void pulsed, its edges curling and twisting, and I saw something move within it, something dark and formless, its shape constantly shifting, its movements slow and deliberate. It didn't have a face, not exactly, but I felt its eyes on me, cold and unrelenting, boring into my very soul. The voice spoke again, louder now, its tone sharper, and I felt my knees buckle beneath the weight of it. The book slipped from my hands, landing with a hollow thud on the pedestal, and the symbols flared one final time before extinguishing completely. The room plunged into darkness, the whispers silenced, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the faint hum of the void. And then, from the depths of the darkness, came a sound, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the chamber, shaking the very walls. It was deep and primal, filled with a rage so intense it made my chest tighten, my vision blur. The presence in the void moved closer, its form solidifying, and I felt the edges of my sanity begin to unravel. Claire's hand found mine, her grip tight and trembling, and I clung to it like a lifeline. The growl grew louder, its vibrations rattling my teeth, and the void surged forward, spilling over the edges of the pedestal like a flood of shadows. "Run," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a plea. And then the darkness swallowed us whole. The darkness was alive. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was something with weight, with form, pressing down on me from every side, clawing at the edges of my thoughts. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe. The air was thick, choking, filled with the acrid stench of smoke and decay. My ears buzzed with an electric hum that felt like it was drilling into my skull, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the whispers began again. My fingers dug into Claire's arm, her grip the only tether keeping me from completely unraveling. The ground beneath us felt unstable, shifting and vibrating as though it might collapse at any moment. I couldn't see her face, couldn't hear her voice over the cacophony around us, but I could feel her trembling, could sense her fear as acutely as my own. It was like the air itself had turned against us. Something moved in the darkness, a faint, barely perceptible ripple in the void. It was slow, deliberate, like a predator circling its prey, its presence pressing closer with each passing second. I couldn't see it, but I felt it, a weight bearing down on me, forcing me to my knees. My chest tightened, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, and I felt the burn of the marks on my wrist flare once more, searing through my arm like fire. Then the growling returned. It was deep and guttural, vibrating through the air, through my bones, through the very foundation of the room. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was everywhere, surrounding us, resonating in the walls, the floor, the very space we occupied. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a force, filling every corner of the void with its unrelenting rage. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, their tones shifting from soft and teasing to sharp and urgent, like they were trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. My mind felt stretched thin, fraying at the edges, and I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out. But it was useless. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were inside me, twisting through my thoughts, filling the spaces where my own voice should have been. Claire tugged at my arm, pulling me back toward the edge of the chamber, but the ground beneath us shifted again, tilting sharply. I stumbled, falling to my knees, and my flashlight clattered to the floor, its weak beam cutting a jagged line through the darkness. The light wavered, catching on something ahead, something that shouldn't have been there. It was a figure, standing motionless in the void. Its outline was faint, its form flickering like a mirage, but I could see enough to know it wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its posture too rigid, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, fixed on me. The growling stopped. The whispers fell silent. And in the stillness that followed, I heard a single word, spoken in a voice that wasn't mine. Run. Here. The figure moved. It wasn't fast. Not at first. Its steps were slow, deliberate. The sound of its movements a soft, wet shuffle that sent a shiver down my spine. But there was something about the way it moved, the unnatural fluidity of its limbs, that made my stomach churn. It didn't feel like it was walking. It felt like it was unfolding, stretching itself toward us, its form growing darker, more solid with each step. Claire screamed, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife, and the sound snapped me out of my paralysis. I grabbed her hand, pulling her to her feet, and we stumbled backward, away from the figure, toward the faint outline of the staircase. My flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker with each passing second, but it was enough to see that the figure wasn't alone. There were more of them. They emerged from the shadows, their forms shifting and twisting, their movements slow and unnatural. Some crawled along the ground, their limbs bending in ways that made my stomach twist. Others clung to the walls, their jagged, angular shapes blending with the carvings etched into the stone. Their eyes, or where their eyes should have been, burned with a faint, flickering light, and they moved in perfect unison, like they were connected, like they were all part of the same entity. The whispers returned, louder this time, more chaotic, their tones sharp and grating. The figures moved closer, their shapes merging and separating, their limbs stretching toward us like shadows cast by a flame. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I could do was run. The staircase was ahead, its steps barely visible in the weak light of my flashlight. The ground beneath us trembled as we ran, deep cracks spreading through the stone, the air filled with the sound of splintering rock. The figures followed, their movements faster now, more erratic, their forms flickering in and out of focus like they were caught between worlds. We reached the stairs, our feet slamming against the wood as we scrambled upward, the narrow space forcing us into a single file. The air grew thinner the higher we climbed, each breath a struggle, the growling and whispers growing louder, more oppressive, as though they were chasing us, closing in from every direction. The trapdoor was still open, the faintest sliver of moonlight visible through the gap, and I reached for it, my fingers scraping against the edge of the wood. But before I could pull myself up, the floor beneath us shifted again, the entire staircase lurching violently to one side. I lost my footing, my flashlight tumbling from my grasp. and I fell, my hands scrabbling for anything to hold on to. Claire caught my arm, her grip iron-tight, and with a strength I didn't know she had, she hauled me upward, her breath ragged and uneven. The figures were on the stairs now, their movements impossibly fast, their jagged limbs clawing at the wood, tearing chunks from the staircase as they climbed. Their eyes burned brighter, their whispers turning into a deafening roar, and I felt the marks on my wrist flare with a heat so intense it brought tears to my eyes. We reached the top, collapsing onto the cold, hard floor of the cabin. I kicked a trapdoor shut, the sound of it slamming into place echoing through the room. And for a moment, the silence was absolute. The whispers stopped. The growling ceased. The only sound was the pounding of my heart, the ragged gasps of my breath. But the stillness didn't last. The trapdoor rattled beneath us, the wood splintering as something slammed against it from below. The carvings on the walls flared to life, their jagged lines glowing with that sickly pulsating light, and the whispers began again, faint but growing, threading through the room like smoke. Claire looked at me, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "It's not stopping," she whispered. "It's coming." And I realized, with a sinking certainty, that there was nowhere left to run. The trapdoor shuddered again, the wood groaning under the force of whatever was below. The air in the cabin was suffocating, heavy with the electric hum of something ancient and alive. The symbols carved into the walls burned brighter, their jagged lines twisting and shifting, as though they were reacting to the presence below. I pressed my hands against the trapdoor, trying to keep it shut, but each impact from beneath sent a jolt through my arms, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. Claire paced behind me, her breathing shallow and rapid. She was muttering to herself, her hands clutching her head, as though trying to block out the whispers. I could hear them too, louder now, threading through the room like smoke, their overlapping voices forming patterns I couldn't understand, but felt deep in my chest. They weren't just sounds. They were thoughts, invasive and relentless, digging into the corners of my mind and pulling at something I didn't want to face. "We can't stay here," Claire said, her voice shaking. She stopped pacing, her eyes wide and frantic as she looked at me. "It's going to break through. We have to do something." "Do what?" I snapped, my voice harsher than I intended. I was shaking, my hands trembling against the trapdoor. "Run? There's nowhere to go. Whatever this is, it's not just in the basement. It's everywhere." The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. I didn't want to believe them, but I knew they were true. The marks on my wrist pulsed again, a sharp, searing heat that made me wince, and I saw Claire clutching at her arm, her own marks glowing faintly in the dim light. They weren't just symbols. They were bindings, anchors, tying us to whatever was happening here. We weren't just caught in its web. We were part of it. The trapdoor rattled harder, splinters flying from its edges, and I felt my resolve crack. I stumbled back as the wood began to bow inward, the force from below growing more relentless. Claire grabbed my arm, pulling me away as the symbols on the walls flared with a blinding light, the jagged lines glowing so brightly they burned after images into my vision. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, their voices overlapping until they became one continuous, unrelenting scream. And then the trapdoor burst open. The force of it sent me sprawling backward, my head slamming against the floor. Dazed, I blinked up at the jagged hole in the floor, my breath catching as I saw the darkness spill out, thick and oily, like ink spreading across the room. It wasn't just shadows. It had weight, substance, curling and writhing as it seeped across the floor, climbing up the walls, engulfing everything it touched. And in the center of it, something began to rise. The figure wasn't human. Not entirely. Its form was long and angular, its limbs too thin, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Its head tilted at an odd angle, its face obscured by the darkness that clung to it like a shroud. But its eyes burned with a sickly, flickering light, unblinking and cold, and they locked onto me with a force that stole the breath from my lungs. I scrambled back, my palms scraping against the rough wood of the floor as the figure stepped fully into the room. The darkness around it pulsed, rippling outward like a heartbeat, and the symbols on the walls seemed to react, their light dimming and flaring in time with its movements. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough, a suffocating, overwhelming force that pressed down on me, sinking into my thoughts and twisting them into something unrecognizable. Claire was screaming, her voice raw and desperate. But I couldn't tear my gaze away from the figure. It moved closer, its limbs stretching unnaturally, the sound of its movements, a wet, shuffling scrape that made my stomach churn. The darkness around it surged forward, tendrils of shadow curling toward me, and I felt the marks on my wrist burn hotter, their lines spreading further up my arm, curling around my neck like chains. Get up. Claire's voice cut through the chaos, and I felt her hands grab my shoulders, pulling me to my feet. The moment she touched me, the marks on my skin flared, and for a brief second, the darkness recoiled, shrinking back toward the figure. It wasn't much, but it was enough. We ran. The door to the cabin loomed ahead, its edges glowing faintly with the same light as the symbols on the walls. I didn't question it. My body moved on instinct, my legs carrying me forward, even as the darkness surged after us, the whispers growing sharper, more frantic. I could feel it at my back, cold and unrelenting, brushing against my skin like 1,000 clawed hands. It wasn't just chasing us. It was pulling us back, dragging us toward it. Claire reached the door first, throwing it open, and the cold night air hit me like a slap. The mist was still there, thick and oppressive, but it was nothing compared to what was inside the cabin. We stumbled out, our feet slipping on the damp earth, and I turned just in time to see the darkness surge to the threshold, stopping abruptly as though it couldn't cross the boundary. The figure stood in the doorway, its burning eyes fixed on us. And for a moment, I thought we might be safe. Then the whispers started again. They were different this time, louder, more urgent, and I realized with a sickening clarity that they weren't coming from the cabin anymore. They were coming from the forest. The mist curled around us, thicker now, colder, and I saw shapes moving within it, shadows slipping between the trees, flickering in and out of sight. They weren't human. They weren't anything I could recognize, but they were coming. "We can't stop," Claire said, her voice trembling. She grabbed my hand, pulling me away from the cabin, into the mist. "If we stop, it'll take us." I wanted to argue, to tell her that running was pointless, but the words died in my throat. The whispers were everywhere now, threading through the mist, surrounding us, closing in. The marks on my wrist burned like fire, and I felt them pulling at me, tugging me toward the darkness that stretched endlessly ahead. The forest swallowed us whole. The forest wasn't just dark. It was raw. The air clung to my skin, heavy and cold, and every breath tasted like damp earth and ash. The trees stretched endlessly upward, their gnarled branches twisting into jagged shapes that blotted out the sky. The whispers were louder now, threading through the mist, weaving between the trees like they were alive. They weren't just voices. They were thoughts, intrusive and relentless, clawing at the edges of my mind. Claire was ahead of me, her figure barely visible through the thick fog. She moved quickly, her steps frantic and uneven, but I could see her glancing over her shoulder, checking to make sure I was still behind her. I wanted to tell her to stop, to slow down, but my voice wouldn't come. It felt trapped in my chest, caught in the same oppressive weight that pressed down on every inch of this place. The marks on my wrist flared again, their jagged lines glowing faintly in the darkness. The heat of them was unbearable, like molten metal searing into my skin, and I clutched my arm, trying to block out the pain. It didn't help. Lonely. I'd still be. It didn't help. The marks weren't just burning. They were moving. The lines twisted and shifted, spreading further up my arm, curling around my neck like vines. They pulsed in time with the whispers, as if they were alive, as if they were feeding off the forest itself. Something moved in the mist. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and turned toward the sound. It wasn't loud, just the faintest rustle, the kind of noise that could have been the wind if the air wasn't so unnaturally still. My flashlight flickered as I swept it over the trees, the beam cutting weakly through the fog. But I didn't see anything, just shadows, too many shadows, their shapes stretching and shifting as though they were watching me. Claire grabbed my arm, her grip tight and trembling, and I nearly screamed. "We have to keep moving," she said, her voice low and urgent. Her eyes darted around the forest, wide and filled with a fear I'd never seen in her before. "It's closing in." I didn't ask what she meant. Empties. I didn't need to. I could feel it too, the way the forest seemed to shift around us, the way the shadows crept closer with every passing second. It wasn't just the darkness. It was something deeper, something older, and it was watching us. We stumbled forward, our footsteps muffled by the soft, damp earth. The trees loomed closer now, their twisted branches reaching down like claws, and the mist grew thicker, wrapping around us like a living thing. I could barely see Claire anymore, her figure reduced to a faint silhouette in the distance. The whispers were louder here, almost deafening, their voices overlapping until they became one continuous, grating hum that burrowed into my skull. Then the forest shifted. It wasn't subtle. Die Evel Suber Mischelend. One moment, the ground beneath my feet was solid, and the next it was gone, replaced by a steep, rocky incline that sent me tumbling forward. My flashlight flew from my hand, its beam spinning wildly through the darkness before disappearing completely. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs, and rolled to a stop at the base of the slope. The world spun around me, and for a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my heart, loud and uneven, drowning out everything else. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and the taste of copper filled my mouth. I tried to push myself up, but my arms felt weak, trembling under the weight of whatever had taken hold of this place. When I finally looked up, Claire was gone. Panic surged through me, sharp and immediate, cutting through the haze in my mind. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the sharp pain in my side, and scanned the forest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The mist was thicker here, the trees closer, their jagged shapes pressing in from all sides. I called her name, my voice breaking, but it was swallowed by the whispers, their relentless hum drowning out everything else. The forest felt alive. Now, its presence pressing against me, suffocating. The shadows were moving, slipping between the trees, flickering at the edges of my vision. They weren't just shapes anymore. They were figures, tall and angular, their limbs too long, their movements too smooth. They didn't make a sound, but I could feel them watching me, their hollow eyes burning into my skin. The marks on my wrist flared again, the pain sharp and searing, and I stumbled back, clutching my arm. The lines had spread further now, twisting up my neck, curling around my jaw like a noose. They pulsed with a faint, sickly light, matching the rhythm of the whispers, and I felt a sharp, insistent tug in the center of my chest, pulling me forward. I didn't want to move, didn't want to follow the pull, but my legs began to move on their own, dragging me deeper into the forest. The ground beneath me shifted with every step, soft and uneven, and the air grew colder, sharper, biting against my skin. The shadows pressed closer, their shapes flickering and distorting, and the whispers shifted, their tones rising and falling like a chant. Then I saw her. Claire was ahead, standing in the center of a small clearing, her back to me. The fog around her was thicker, swirling like smoke, and the light from her flashlight barely pierced the darkness. She wasn't moving. Her arms hung limply at her sides, her head tilted downward, and her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. The marks on her wrist were glowing brighter now, their lines spreading across her arms and chest, and I could see them pulsing faintly in the darkness. I called her name, my voice trembling, but she didn't respond. She didn't even turn. I stepped closer, my hands shaking, and reached out to touch her shoulder. The moment my fingers brushed against her, the whispers stopped. The silence was absolute, pressing against my ears, my chest like a weight. The fog stilled, the air growing colder, and for a moment I thought time itself had frozen. Then Claire turned, slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her eyes weren't hers anymore. They burned with a faint flickering light, unblinking and cold, and her face was pale, her expression blank. The marks on her skin pulsed brighter, their light casting jagged shadows across her features. And her lips parted, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. "You were never meant to leave," it said, low and guttural, its tone dripping with malice. The ground beneath us cracked, deep fissures spreading outward, and the shadows surged forward, wrapping around Claire, around me, pulling us both into the void. The void wasn't empty. It was alive, pulsating with a rhythm that wasn't natural, wasn't human. I couldn't tell where it ended or began. It stretched endlessly, swallowing everything. The cold here was different. It wasn't just a temperature. It was a presence crawling into my skin, pressing against my chest like a weight, twisting around my thoughts until I couldn't tell which ones were mine and which ones belonged to it. Claire stood in front of me, her body slack, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. The flickering glow in her eyes pulsed in time with the marks on her skin, their jagged lines crawling across her arms and neck like cracks in porcelain. She wasn't moving, but she wasn't still either. Her body swayed faintly, as though caught in an invisible current, and the longer I looked at her, the less she felt like Claire. The ground beneath us shifted, rippling like water, and I stumbled, my legs buckling under the weight of the air around me. The darkness coiled tighter, wrapping around my ankles, my wrists, dragging me closer to her. I tried to move, tried to speak, but my throat felt raw, my chest heavy. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic hum of the void, growing louder with each passing second, vibrating through my bones. And then Claire spoke. "I see you. Emmanuel, concepted share." The voice wasn't hers. "Heaven, me far, dear." The voice wasn't hers. It wasn't even human. It was layered, distorted, as though it came from deep within the void itself, and the sound of it made my stomach turn. Her head snapped toward me, her movements sharp and unnatural, and for a moment I thought I saw something else behind her eyes, something watching me, studying me, pulling at the edges of my mind. "You think you can leave," the voice said, low and guttural, dripping with malice. You think you can stop this? Her hand shot out, faster than I could react, grabbing my wrist. The marks on her skin flared brighter, their light spilling across the void, and the pain in my own marks surged, sharp and searing, like fire racing through my veins. I cried out, the sound raw and broken, but she didn't let go. Her grip tightened, her nails digging into my skin, and I felt the pull. The same pull I'd felt in the forest, in the cabin, at the trapdoor. It was inside me now, deeper than it had ever been, and it was dragging me under. You were chosen, the voice said, its tone shifting, growing sharper. You don't fight it. You don't win. You surrender. The darkness surged around us, curling and writhing, and I felt it pressing against my back, pushing me forward, closer to Claire, closer to the light burning in her eyes. It wasn't just pulling me, it was consuming me, sinking into my skin, my thoughts, my memories. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. It was everywhere, and it was endless. But then, for a moment, there was silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes with peace. It would be inside what comes with peace. It was heavy, oppressive, vibrating with a tension that made my chest ache. The void stilled, the darkness pulling back slightly, and I felt the faintest thread of air fill my lungs. Claire's grip loosened, her hand falling to her side, and her head tilted again, her expression blank, her eyes flickering faintly. I staggered back, my legs trembling, and I felt the weight of the book in my hand before I even realized I was holding it. Its cover was warm, almost hot, the symbols etched into its surface glowing faintly. I didn't remember picking it up. I didn't even know how it had gotten here, but it was here now. And it was heavier than I remembered. It pulsed in time with the marks on my skin, and as I looked at it, I felt the whispers begin again. They weren't coming from the void anymore. They were coming from the book. The ground beneath me shifted again, rippling outward, and I stumbled, clutching the book tighter. The whispers grew louder, their tones overlapping, rising and falling in a chaotic symphony that filled the space. They weren't just sounds. They were words, shapes, patterns, threading through my thoughts, pulling at the frayed edges of my mind. They weren't asking me to read the book. They were commanding me. You don't have to, Claire said, her voice soft and distant. She wasn't looking at me anymore. Yell, silence, bah. Her gaze was fixed on the void, on the darkness swirling ahead of us, her body still swaying faintly. You can let it take you. It's easier that way. Her voice was hers again, but it wasn't right. It was hollow, empty, like she wasn't fully there. The marks on her skin pulsed brighter, their lines spreading further, and I could see them now, crawling across her face, curling around her jaw, her lips, her eyes. She didn't seem to notice. Eyelids, or maybe she didn't care. Tears. You're lying, I said, my voice shaking, barely audible over the whispers. You don't know what it wants. She turned to me then, slowly, her eyes flickering brighter, and for a moment her face twisted into something unrecognizable, sharp and angular, her features distorted, her mouth stretching into a smile that wasn't hers. "Don't I?" she said, her tone light, almost teasing. "I'm already part of it." The darkness surged again, and I felt it press against my back, my chest, my mind. The book pulsed in my hands, the heat of it unbearable now. And I knew what it wanted. I knew what I had to do. But the thought of it made my stomach turn, made my hands tremble, made my legs want to give out beneath me. I opened the book. The light that spilled out wasn't natural. It was harsh, blinding, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The symbols on the pages burned with a sickly pulsating glow, their jagged lines twisting and shifting, forming shapes I couldn't understand but couldn't look away from. The whispers grew louder, sharper, their tones rising in urgency, and I felt the pull again, stronger this time, dragging me into the pages, into the light. The void screamed. It wasn't a sound. It was a force, a vibration, tearing through the space, shaking the ground, the air, the very fabric of the void itself. The darkness recoiled, pulling back, writhing and twisting as though in pain, and I felt the marks on my skin flare one final time, the heat of them searing into my bones. The light consumed everything. The light didn't fade. It swallowed everything. A pulsing, relentless brightness that pressed against my eyes, my chest, my mind. I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed anymore. The heat radiating from the book scorched my palms, but I couldn't let go. It wouldn't let me. The marks on my skin burned brighter than ever, their jagged lines stretching across my arms and chest, curling around my neck like vines. They weren't just glowing, they were alive, pulsing in time with the rhythm of the book, as though the two were one and the same. The whispers were gone, replaced by a single deafening hum that vibrated through every fiber of my being. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, something ancient and vast, pressing against the edges of my thoughts, threatening to consume me. My knees buckled under the weight of it, and I fell. The book clutched to my chest like a lifeline, even as it threatened to pull me under. Claire was still there, but she wasn't moving. The glow in her eyes flickered weakly, the marks on her skin fading and brightening in irregular bursts, as though whatever had taken hold of her was struggling to maintain its grip. Her body swayed slightly, her head tilting toward me, and for a moment her lips moved. I couldn't hear her voice over the hum, but I saw her mouth form a single word: stop. Stop. I didn't know if she was begging me to let go of the book, or if she was pleading with whatever force had taken hold of her. It didn't matter. I couldn't stop. The book was a part of me now, its pull stronger than ever, dragging me deeper into its grasp. The light pouring from its pages was blinding, but I couldn't look away. The symbols burned themselves into my vision, their jagged lines shifting and twisting, forming patterns that felt like they had always been there, buried deep in the recesses of my mind. The void screamed again, a soundless, gut-wrenching force that tore through the space around us. The darkness surged forward, curling and writhing like a living thing. But it couldn't reach me. The light from the book flared brighter, pushing it back, holding it at bay, even as it clawed and lashed out, its movements frantic and desperate. Claire stumbled forward, her body jerking unnaturally, her arms outstretched as though reaching for me. Her face was pale, her features slack, but her eyes burned with a mix of terror and something else, resignation. Oh, she wasn't fighting it anymore. She was letting it take her. No, I whispered, my voice hoarse and broken. I reached for her, but my hand stopped short, trembling in the air between us. The marks on my wrist flared, their glow matching the light from her skin. And I felt the pull again, sharper this time, dragging me toward her, toward the void, toward the thing that had claimed her. You have to let it go, she said, her voice low and hollow, like it was coming from somewhere far away. It's the only way. I shook my head, my grip on the book tightening. I can't, I said, the words tumbling out in a ragged gasp. It won't let me. The darkness surged again, its edges curling around Claire, pulling her closer to the void. Her body jerked violently, her head snapping back, and she screamed. A raw, piercing sound that cut through the hum, through the light, through everything. The marks on her skin burned brighter, their lines spreading faster, and I saw them shift, twisting and writhing like snakes, coiling around her throat. Her face, her eyes, her eye. The book trembled in my hands, its light flickering, and I felt it then, a crack, a shift, like something deep inside it was breaking apart. The symbols on its pages flared one last time, their jagged lines searing into my skin, and I realized with a sinking certainty what I had to do. The book wasn't just a key. It was a door. It was a door. The marks on my skin pulsed again, sharper this time, the heat of them unbearable, and I felt the pull intensify, dragging me toward the center of the void. My legs moved on their own, each step heavier than the last, and the closer I got to the edge, the more I felt the presence of whatever was inside. It wasn't just watching me. It was waiting. I reached the edge, the darkness curling around my feet, and I looked down into the void. It wasn't empty. Shadows writhed and twisted, their shapes flickering and shifting, forming faces, hands, bodies, all stretching upward, reaching for me. They weren't just shapes. They were souls, trapped, screaming, desperate to escape, but unable to break free. And then I saw it. The thing in the center of the void wasn't a shadow. It was massive, its form flickering in and out of focus, its limbs stretching and curling like smoke. Its eyes burned brighter than the marks on my skin, brighter than the light from the book, and they locked onto me with a force that brought me to my knees. The hum stopped, the void still, and the thing spoke. "You cannot undo this," it said, its voice low and guttural, each word resonating through my chest. "You cannot win." I clutched the book tighter, the light from its pages flickering weakly, and I forced myself to stand. My legs trembled, my chest heaving, but I didn't look away. "I don't have to win," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I just have to close the door." "It is to mice you pay to down the curious," the thing roared, its voice a deafening, primal scream that tore through the void, shaking the ground beneath me. The shadows surged forward, their shapes clawing at my legs, my arms, my chest. But I didn't stop. I held the book over the edge, its light flaring one last time, and I let it fall. The moment the book hit the void, the light exploded outward, blinding and searing, consuming everything in its path. The shadows recoiled, the void collapsing in on itself, and I felt the pull intensify, sharper, stronger, dragging me toward the edge. I stumbled back, my legs barely holding me, and I reached for Claire, but she was already gone. The void collapsed completely, the light fading, and the silence that followed was absolute. When I opened my eyes, the forest was still. "You will end." The mist was gone, the air clear, but the marks on my skin remained, their jagged lines faint but still pulsing, a reminder of what had happened. I was alone. The cabin was gone, the void was gone, and Claire was gone. But the whispers lingered, faint and distant, threading through the air like a melody I couldn't escape. I stumbled forward, my legs weak, my chest heavy, and I felt the weight of the marks, pulling at me, dragging me towards something unseen. The void was gone, but it wasn't finished. It never would be, because some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed.